What up, everybody? Welcome to the IAG Thursday thing. This thing we do every Thursday, even when we feel under the weather. And this week is going to be a banger. We've been planning this one for a few weeks. This was a terrible idea that Mike McGinnis came up with while having a conversation with Sam. And long story short, we wanted to get everybody together and basically talk about which ECUs they like, don't like, and why. Graham then got drug into this. So now we've got a three-way battle royale of what ECUs they like and they don't. And this is going to be great. I'm really stoked about this. If you are listening on the podcast, we love hearing you. Do us a favor, share this. If you're listening on Discord live, recording right now, do us a favor. Make sure you share the podcast. Maybe throw us a like, or share the Discord link. That helps out too. But we really appreciate it. We're trying to get this thing to grow. Usually, I am joined by my partner in crime, Warranty, but he's got a bunch of work going on, and usually in the background we got producer Jordan rocking the house and keeping us together in the background and making sure everything works. Unfortunately, he's out today, and Randy, who makes our thumbnails, he knocked it out of the park with our thumbnail this week, so thank you, Randy. That was fantastic. So like I said, this week, we are joined by not one, not two, but three tuners. All three of these guys have all been on the show at one point. Of course, my alarm decides to go off right then. Have all been on the show at one point, but we've never had them on here together, and this is kind of unprecedented. I'm really stoked. So we have, like I said, we have three different tuners. First and foremost, we have Mike McGinnis, who has worked for everybody under the sun, Innovative Tuning, Cobb, everybody else. Mike, how you doing, man?
Great, man. Thanks for having me on again.
Dude, this was a great idea for a show, and I'm super stoked about this. And this is gonna be great. We're also joined by Samuel Hiu. Is that really your last name? What is your last name? Should we just go with Hiu? Either way, he's Sam is the wiring guy. Okay, the absolute wiring guy. My brain is literally turning off. Dialed in performance or dialed in motorsports, performance motorsports.
Yep.
Motorsports, right?
Motorsports.
Okay, dialed in motorsports. It's dialed in either way in Kansas, but also another tuner. This whole thing is the brainchild between Mike and him. And we had Sam on a few times when we were out at his shop wiring Boogie. He's the brainchild behind all the wiring for Boogie. And Sam's great. And then we also got Graham on here, who has been on here quite a few times talking about standalone ECUs, all sorts of fun stuff. Graham's a close friend of mine, also does Time Attack, and he is the tuner at Boosted Performance Tuning, Boosted Performance being him and his wife. Graham, what's up, man?
What's up, man? How you doing?
I'm good. I'm stoked. This is going to be fun. I'm happy you... I know you're busy as hell right now, so I'm super stoked all three of you guys managed to cut some time out to come do this, because I think this is going to be a lot of fun, super informative to a lot of people, an absolute ton of people. So basically how this is going to work, I am going to go down the list of a whole pile of different modern Subaru tuning options. Now, this is not every ECU out there. Hopefully, I don't skip anything major. And in the end of the show, if you guys have maybe an ECU that we didn't bring up or a tuning option that we didn't bring up, please post it in the comments and we'll try to get to that. But we're gonna start from, excuse me. Damn it. I might be fighting with some vid right now, so bear with me. We're gonna start with the let's call it the simplest of tuning options. One of them I should have just thrown in here is a manual boost controller, and we should have just said that. But starting with the simplest of tuning options all the way to the final one that I have on here is a Bosch Motorsports ECU. So like all over the place. And I tried to catch everything that is normally used with a modern Subaru in any way. And again, we might be glazing over something, but this is mostly Subaru oriented because obviously it's the IAG Thursday thing, and we tend to work with Subarus. So we're going to gear this a bit more towards that. But there is good information in here for just about anybody who's looking to tune just about anything. These guys are basically gonna go one at a time, and they're going to rank them in a really simple fashion, which is basically nah, meh, or yeah, that's all right. Right? So it's basically a no, meh, or yes. So yay, nay, or meh. And we're gonna go with that. And then there's really not a winner or a loser. It's more of just I want to get their thoughts on each one of these. Some of these we're probably gonna spend a little more time on than others because some of them are just ungodly outdated or almost in here as a meme. And we're gonna go from there. So to start, we're gonna start with a meme just because it's hilarious. One of the easiest ways to tune these cars, it wasn't the easiest, but it was one of the first ways people started tuning O2WRXs when they first got here, was the Apexi Super AFC 2. Okay? I think this completely predates Sam. I don't know if Graham ever messed with one or not, but I guarantee Mike's played around with this thing before. So, I guess let's get your thoughts, Mike, on tuning a modern Subaru with a SAFC 2.
20 years ago, maybe. Today, definitely not.
We're just gonna put a no.
Yeah.
I'm just going in order as I got them on here. Graham, what's your take on SAFC 2s?
Yeah, that's a hell no for me, dog. I've maybe seen 2 of these in my life and tried to poke at them, and it was just not good. And so, what I'm gonna take a quick moment to say that while you mentioned this, we're laughing about this old Piggyback ECU, or like Piggyback controller or whatever. There are modern versions that are still out there now. You can buy for a brand new F824 WRX and try to tune it that way. So it might not be a bad idea if we kind of touch on what this is and why it can be kind of dangerous.
That's fair.
So the quick and dirty that I'll just say is that basically you're manipulating signals. You're taking in a MAF signal and you're tricking it to look lower or higher. You're tricking temperature sensors. You're basically just doing trickery to get the ECU to operate differently. But the ECU has no knowledge of the controller, and it has no ability to understand what's going on. You run the risk of making it run very lean, maybe too rich, causing knock. So those are just very dangerous, and there's something that we won't even remotely begin to entertain. So that's kind of my 2 cents on that.
Sam, you ever mess with an SAFC 2?
It's been a long time. Now I would say that's one of the first things I tried on my Celica in college way back in the day. And to add on to Graham to kind of, give a little bit of insight on the wiring side of things, for the SAFC and what it does, you basically intercept your main sensor that determines the load on the ECU calculation, and you basically change the voltages on it, right? So you tell it that, let's say that you do simplest one, the throttle position sensor. So you tell it that you're at, 100% throttle when you're at 50, and if you're boosted, then that adds more fuel, right? So basically what you used to do back in the day is you put bigger injectors in it, and then you would tell the ECU that it's at a lower load than it actually is, so it feeds like a reasonable amount of fuel and keeps the AFRs in check. But what that did really badly back in the day is that on every single tuning map that I've ever done in my life, the lower the load, typically the more ignition timing that you have. So you basically inadvertently, by making the AFRs right, you made the timing wrong, and you ended up killing the engine anyway. So that's the quick and dirty rundown adding on to what Graham said. It's a no for me.
It's a no, dog. All right. So SAFC 2 is out of the way. All right. Now we're going to get into something a little more serious. Okay. That people have used and actually used with some pretty good success. Open source tuning. So it was kind of a big jump going from the SAFC 2 to open source. But essentially when we talk about open source, we're talking about using like a Tactrix cable or something along those lines to reflash your stock ECU using some internet software or something like that. Some of it's actually pretty refined in some of the stuff you can do, but yeah, let's go back the other way. We're gonna start with Sam. What's your thoughts on modern open source tuning? Say your
Okay,
piece here real quick.
All right. The way I started is inherently there's nothing wrong with open source tuning. It's just a form of reflash. And it's you basically use a simple tool that doesn't cost a lot of money. And depending on what you want and need out of the car, it's perfectly fine. The thing that I said first is that there's a bunch of like mods to the firmware that you can get from different sources or make on your own if you're savvy enough. And this is something that Mike can probably like put more information into. I'm not super in depth with the whole like stock ECU repurposing of different areas of the code and whatnot. As far as I understand it, if you want to do things that are beyond the capabilities of the code as it is in the stock ECU, you have to essentially take different parts of the code and rewrite them so that they can do things like you can on a Carberry ECU, which is just it's a mod to a stock JDM ECU. I don't think there's anything wrong. I think there's a lot of bad rap to the open source because it's a really easy and really low entry barrier to it, and pretty much anybody that can get their hands on a free to download software like ECU Flash or ROM Raider and can buy a $150 Tactrix cable, and there's even some clones out there that are even less, can get into it. And so because of that, it got a lot of bad rap because of people that were getting into it that maybe weren't really, they didn't really know what they were doing and whatnot. And, oh, what's your car tuned on? Oh, open source. Oh, why did it blow up? Oh, it sucks. No, it's really the person behind the keyboard that determines, how good the tune is, whether that's on open source, on a standalone, it doesn't matter what it is. So all in all, it's just, it's a tool to tune the factory ECU, and there are options out there that you can get to rewrite some parts of the code for race applications and stuff like that. So it's fine. It's really dependent on what you needed to do and what you need the car to do. So to me, it's kind of like a maybe.
Okay, you get an M. You get an M. All right, Graham.
Sure. Yeah. So, I've done a fair amount. I'm sure a lot of us Subaru tuners, I'm sure Mike too, we probably started off open source tuning at some point. Whether it was just really the only option at the time or because we weren't Cobb tuners yet, we were just screwing around with our own stuff. So, open source, like Sam said, it's just a reflash of the stock ECU. So you are reprogramming everything. That's great. As long as the open source software is well defined and the tables are understood and you know what you're working with, it can be a perfectly fine tool. Carberry was a good example. That was basically started off as a group N rally ROM that was extracted from an ECU, and Jason Carberry went and modified it and added flex fuel to it, added map switching, did all the code changes like Sam was talking about to give it all these extra functions. And it's a pretty powerful ROM that every once in a while I do still dabble with if needed. So the downsides to open source, like he said, you're not going to, outside of Carberry, you're not always going to have a lot of custom code written. So like, what the stuff that Cobb does with adding flex fuel and speed density and things, you don't have any of that. So you're kind of limited to, math-based tuning and certain power levels. You're not going to have flex fuel. So the downsides is just you don't have those extra things if you need them. And also, a lot of tuners don't necessarily want to do open source because it doesn't have any kind of tuner lock security. So if you write a really nice tune you spent hours and hours and hours on and put it on someone's car, somebody else could grab that and just, kind of replicate it, use it elsewhere. So you don't, you can't protect your intellectual property with it. So you won't find a lot of really good tuners that offer open source. So there can be kind of a downside there. But it's okay in the right application, but it's kind of this day and age with how complex everything is, direct injection engines. I don't think we're going to see open source really exist in any kind of capacity like it used to in the old days.
So,
right on.
What are you giving it?
I give it, like a kind of a low, like I wouldn't, if you have an older car and the right person, yes. If you're looking at newer vehicles, no.
So, are you calling it a meh?
I'm calling it a meh at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a meh.
Meh.
All right. Mike, what do you got?
Right off the bat, I'll give it the maybe. Yeah, I mean, like Graham said, I think it's something that we've all used at some point and served a purpose, and you can certainly make changes and put them on a car. So within Reflash tuning, I think open source, because of the nature of how open source happens with many different people working on it, you're going to have maybe, for example, one person who's extremely good at reverse engineering happens to own, let's say, an 05 WRX, and they invest a ton of their time into making that really, really good, really well defined, all the tables work. Then maybe, somebody asks for support for a 2015 STI, and potentially the person working on that might not have the same level of expertise, or maybe they just don't have as much spare time to put into it. So I think one of the things you'll find that the guys kind of alluded to is some ROMs are better defined than others. Some of that comes down to how thoroughly they're defined and how many tables are available. Some of it comes down to whether the tables are accurately defined or not. So, for example, you can end up in a situation where a table appears to be one thing, but is actually, in fact, something else, or the numbers are scaled incorrectly. And if you're not aware of the incorrect definition, you can very easily apply a value that gets run, which is not going to have the result that you're expecting. It's probably the best way to put it. So I think when you talk about open source, it's a huge umbrella, and the reality is you're not going to get a consistent experience across the board. Like the guys were saying, if you have a Carberry ROM that's specific to only a few ECUs that you can use it on, and that gives you that one set of features. If you don't have an 02 to 05 WRX, you're not going to be using that, for example, at least as far as US cars. And then you're looking into something else. There are some folks who have made mods for some of the later 32-bit ECUs, which would be on the 2.5 liter turbo engines, for example, to varying levels of quality and capability. And I would just say that it's kind of spotty in terms of coverage, capability, reliability, and for that reason, it's not something I'm really comfortable offering to customers. I think early on it was a useful learning tool, and if someone's doing DIY stuff, I think it's a really interesting option for them. But in terms of at the professional level, if someone's paying me and they expect a really good result, I want to use a product that I know for sure is going to deliver that. We're not going to run into incorrect table definitions or some sort of quirks that are going to potentially cause issues for them on their vehicle. So I think what I'm saying, in my opinion, is at the DIY level, if you're learning to tune on your own car, it's probably a great tool. If you're not ready to get into a standalone, especially because you start out with a stock tune, you're not starting with nothing. And you can just make small little tweaks, which is how we probably all started learning. If you're operating at a professional level and trying to uphold a really high level of quality, it's probably not the best tool for the job.
Well, you got a hard meh, or maybe.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
All right, but now we're gonna do an elephant in the room. When you talk about tuning in Subarus, at least in the U.S. domestic market, this name's going to come up no matter what. This conversation will be had. So we're going to talk about Cobb, specifically modern Cobb, what you can and can't do. So I think we're going to start again with Mike, just because of his relationship with Cobb. I think he's the perfect person to kick this one off. So Mike, what's your take on Cobb?
Sure. So I was a Cobb fanboy long before I worked there. So I'll just put that out there for full disclosure. There were around 10 or 12 original Cobb Pro tuners that got the software when it became available in 2005, and I'm one of them. So I've been using it for a long time. Had done some Turbo XS UTEC and open source stuff, And when I knew that it was coming out, I was really excited. Obviously, Cobb's come a really long way since then, but what they have had from the beginning is that consistent quality experience, proper table definitions. If you're using it, you know it's going to work. There's, it's very unlikely you're going to brick a car flashing it. A lot of the things that are kind of hit or miss sometimes with open source, you just didn't have to worry about it. So you were operating with a, professional quality product. Then over the years, the access port went through a few revisions, got more and more advanced. You could do more data logging. And with that, the features that they were able to offer in software, including custom features, just kept expanding more and more. So the guys mentioned a few things like speed density and flex fuel that it has, launch control, flat shift, various other things depending on the platform. And in terms of Subaru, I think there's really no question in my mind. It's definitely the go-to if you're looking for the best reflash product for these cars. And I really don't think there's anything particularly close in the market. There is another option we haven't mentioned, but because Cobb is so widely adopted, I think it's pretty much the go-to. Besides that, I think if you're working with a street vehicle in the United States, you're, unless it's a very old vehicle that's exempt for some reason from emissions, you're probably going to be dealing with a stock ECU if you're trying to remain compliant. And in that sense, this becomes the best tool. There's definitely also a lot of people that race on them, have had a lot of success racing on them off-road as well. And we'll definitely get into standalones, I'm sure, as we continue the conversation. But as far as reflashing goes, that's top of the line for street use, for race use. That's about as far as you're going to go with a reflash.
Graham, what's up?
Yeah, I mean, Cobb's fantastic. That's definitely a big yay. It's not obvious, no surprise to hear that from me, being that, I'm a Cobb Pro tuner, and that's a significant chunk of our business, is using Cobb. So yeah, I've been, I'm trying to remember exactly what year it was. I want to say it was 2012, maybe 13, I became a Cobb Pro tuner. So not nearly as early as Mike, but pretty early. If you remember plugging in a USB hasp key, then, you were around in the relatively early days. So, yeah, so I've been using Cobb for a very long time. They've been a fantastic partner. All the things Mike said, it's a fantastic solution. But what maybe he didn't touch on that's extremely valuable, is, I do a lot of work with other companies. I'm wearing an HP Tuners shirt right now. HP Tuners does a fantastic job of defining everything and giving it all to you, but not such a great job of really explaining what's going on. They don't necessarily always have the cars and tune the cars themselves. They don't offer any off-the-shelf maps. They have their reasons for that. It makes a lot of sense. They have a very different.
Wouldn't go too far into that because that's added to the list.
Yeah, so we can touch that on that. But what I like about Cobb is that they buy the vehicles, multiple versions of them that they're supporting, and they do in-house testing. They bring people like Mike in to develop an OTS tune and understand how the tables work, rather than just putting them out there and saying, here you guys go, have fun, start poking at it on you got to buy your own car, which isn't a bad idea for a tuner, or your customer cars. They do that homework, and then they explain how things work so that, when you go in there and calibrate a customer's car, you know what you're doing. So yeah, Cobb is extremely valuable. Cobb is hands down, the best way to go about it for a street car with legal emissions devices on it, but like you said, we can still race on it. The 2017 season of Grid Life that I won was on a Cobb access port. We were using standalones back then. So yeah, definitely a big yay for Cobb and standalone ECUs with that type of a system, or excuse me, stock ECUs.
Sam, what's up?
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, okay,
I can.
You can hear me. All right,
Yes.
so I'm more partial myself to standalone ECUs, and I'll open my my part in this with that. Reason being, most of the cars that I work with are not street cars per se; they're race cars. So I think Mike made a very important distinction as to why he thinks about Cobb and Reflash the way that he thinks about it, and Graham did too. I think the main thing I want to say about Reflash in general is that you are restricted and limited by what the stock ECU is capable of, to the most part, to the most extent. Now, things like what Cobb has done with the fuel pressure differential compensation, flex fuel, launch control, you can adjust your launch control settings right on the access port. You can do live tuning on the stock ECU through the access port, something you can't do with a Tactrix cable at this moment in time. And you've never really been able to do it. So Cobb is kind of like its own thing when it comes to Subarus on that aspect. Um, I think if you have the particular need to have your car be emissions compliant and road legal, and you're not strictly racing the car, I think Cobb is your best, and I say this with a grain of salt, your only option. If you want to be compliant while you're driving to the track and from the track, right? Now you can use this to, you know, set your own micro records and whatnot. We've seen a lot of that recently, especially with the new Cobb Green Speed update that was dropped like 2 years ago at this point, one year ago, something like that, where they took out a bunch of the emissions related DTC codes that you could take off, like your P0420 for not having a catalytic converter and stuff like that. And I think that the main distinction here is that if the car needs to be emissions compliant, Cobb is going to be a solid yes for me over open source Reflash any day of the week. Because it is the only option that makes sense at this point in time. If the car doesn't need to be emissions compliant because it's strictly a race car, then that's a whole different topic, and we'll get into that because we haven't even touched on any standalone ECUs
Yeah,
yet.
standalones are coming. Don't worry. I promise, people.
So to add on top of that, I think like Graham mentioned, like Mike mentioned, Cobb has done a really good job at when you get in the software in there as a tuner. You know what everything does and where everything is for the most part, especially on the platforms that are more well developed. I've used several of the Cobb platforms, and some are defined better than others. Some still need work, like the Volkswagen platform specifically comes to mind. But I think that's just a matter of time and also a matter of interest. You know, like development goes a long way the more people support a certain product. So, like Graham mentioned about HP tuners can maybe define everything and not really give you a sort of handbook, kind of like what Cobb can do, because they've shown us they can do that. Um, so I think that it's basically like, hey, if you want, you know, access ports on Volkswagens to be really good like they are on Subarus, then more people need to start selling Volkswagen access ports so that Cobb can have more funds to, you know, develop that. Because as a small business owner, I can tell you, I'm not wasting my time on things that are not going to make me money. So it's kind of like a catch-22, right? Because if it doesn't make me money, I'm not going to work on it. But if it's not well defined, then people are not going to want to use it, and it's not really going to make me money. So like, what do? It's you get kind of like pinched up against the wall like that.
That's
Um,
just capitalism in general.
yeah, I think that's the nature of the game. But as far as when it comes to Subarus, I think Cobb has done a very impressive job at having everything just there working, and it's good, and it takes the stock ECU to the next level and makes it better. I would say better than more cheap standalone ECUs that are out there. Which is it's a tough thing to say, and that's why people like Graham and many other people have had success with the stock ECU on Cobb Access Port, tuned by them or tuned by whoever, um, in the racing environment. Because if the ECU is capable enough to manage the engine, then you might not get chassis management through the ECU like you can through a complex standalone like a Motec or an Emtron or something like that. But you do get full engine control, and that's pretty much all you need. And you need to have, you know, not one but two right between your legs to be able to race the car. Um, so yeah, I think that's what I have to say the most about Cobb. Now, I do have a question for Mike specifically because I know he's very in depth with the code side of things on Cobb. And I think it's a question that resonates with a lot of people because I've had it asked a lot. There are, like we talked about previously on the reflash things. Um, there's obviously some custom ROMs that have different features that the stock ECU doesn't support on the stock ROM. So why has Cobb never done spark cut on any of the Subaru anything like launch control or anything? Why has that never been an option, Mike? Like it's honestly a curiosity. Like I don't think it's a make or break. It's just like a curiosity. Why is it not an option? Do you know?
Yeah,
Share
that's a
with
good
us?
question. It's something that can be done, certainly. There was a project, hopefully they won't mind me mentioning, to investigate more advanced launch control features. And it was something that I designed along with a reverse engineer. And I would say the testing was highly successful. But that particular feature set was deemed to, I think, be concerning in terms of optics to regulatory bodies, in terms of the types of sounds, sights and sounds that you can create with.
Yeah. Let me put this. So they don't want kids in parking lots doing pop bangs like crazy, and then it's showing up all over the internet, and it coming out that they're tuned with a Cobb access port when they're trying to fight the EPA. Did I get that about right?
Yeah, that sounds about right. So if it was going to be used responsibly, at the drag strip, which is the place it was tested, great. But I think there was concern that not everybody would be a responsible user of it, and the risk might be too high in terms of Cobb being able to continue doing business if they, as a company providing solutions that are viable for the street. I think sometimes there's certain features they have to take a really hard look at and decide maybe this isn't the right move for us, while we're trying to maintain the possibility of selling to people with street vehicles in a compliant fashion.
That makes sense.
Yeah, certainly not for lack of capability in terms of the ECU hardware or the code they can write.
Yeah, I mean, it's there in other like custom codes and stuff. So I know it's possible. Carberry did it with 16-bit ECU. So why would you be able to do it with a 32-bit ECU?
We got a lot we got to cover.
So
I'm moderating. I'm cutting you off.
I appreciate that.
All right. Next one. This is another big one, especially if you're a BRZF4S enthusiast, or maybe you are not of the US, and your biggest reflash option for the most part was ECUTek. Okay. Now, Cobb and ECUTek are now under the same corporate umbrella, and I know they share a lot of stuff. And I know, Mike, you've been working a lot with ECUTek. I'm going to let Graham start this one because I know he's done a lot with ECUTek, even though he's talking. I know he's done a lot with ECUTek. He's been one of their beta testers on all sorts of stuff. So we're going to let Graham start with ECUTek. What's your take on ECUTek, bud?
Okay, yeah. So ECUTek's incredible. I've been working with those guys a very long time. Very shortly after my relationship with Cobb started, I started a relationship with ECUTek. Primarily, it was for tuning the FRS BRZ that came out in 2012. Cobb wasn't interested in working with those cars. They weren't turbocharged, made sense. And so ECUTek picked them up. And so we started using them at that time. Much like Cobb, it's a reflash of the stock ECU. And like Cobb, they go in there and they do a lot of custom code. But the really unique thing about ECUTek, for whatever reason, maybe Mike can speak on it, maybe he can or won't want to, but ECUTek goes into some incredible depth with their ROM customization to the point of creating blank tables that you can use to write your own custom features. You can define the inputs and you can define what output you're going to be changing and how you're going to change it. And you can, you have points where it starts, points where it shuts off, use it in different map modes and map modes themselves. A lot of their tuning has different map modes you can change into to do different things. So they do an incredible level of customization. I've been using them recently for the GR Corolla, and we're already at the point where we can tune crazy amounts of power with crazy amounts of smoothness on a stock ECU, thanks to all their custom code to make that really complex ECU a lot less complex to work with. So yeah, they're a huge thumbs up for me. we use them for FRS BRZ, the GR86, GR Corolla. I don't really use them for Subarus. I have a little bit, but Cobb is so much farther ahead and has so much better support, in my opinion, that it doesn't make sense to push people over to it. So, but yeah, that's ECUTek is a big thumbs up for me.
Sam, what do you got?
So I don't have a lot of experience with ECUTek personally. I know what Graham's saying. I've seen that and I've used some of it, and it's pretty cool. As far as it pertains to Subarus, I think we can go back to that statement I made about money. I think Cobb took the lead in the market in the U.S. and that made them jump ahead on ECUTek as far as Subarus go. And that's why you don't see a lot of Subarus on ECUTek at this point. They do offer, the tuning capabilities for them, but most tuners just kind of default to Cobb because I feel it's a more complete and known. The product awareness is there. I think in the applications like the GR Corolla and the GR86, they're probably like the best options currently. That might change in the future. But it's another reflash. So I won't take much more time. I'll let Mike get back to answer Graham's thing because I want to listen to that. I think that's going to be
yes,
great
no,
insight.
maybe.
I would say in the applications where it's more developed than any other option, yes. Other than that, no. If the car has to stay compliant and it's the best option for it, then go ahead.
That sounds in
It makes
between.
sense.
I'm going to give you a maybe.
Yeah, I guess.
All right, Mike, let's hear it.
Sure, I'll probably be a maybe as well. Honestly, for the exact same reasons. Just like Graham, I didn't have ECUTek until the first gen BRZ FRS came out. It was the solution that made the most sense, so I got it. When the Gen 2 BRZ came out, it was a situation where ECUTek decided to develop a software for it, do the reverse engineering. Cobb did not. But they wanted to offer something, so they had me make calibrations using ECUTek as the delivery mechanism. So that's what we've got for that. In terms of the custom code, I'll say the biggest thing ECUTek does differently is using modular code, which they call race ROM, where essentially they have their custom map set up that they can kind of copy paste. And I assure you it's a bit more complex than that, but copy paste from one ECU to another using common code, where a lot of the time, for example, on older Subaru ECUs, there was so little free space that unique custom code was required per ECU in order for Cobb to give kind of the breadth of custom features that they wanted to. So for example, like on an 04 STI, you'll notice some flex fuel tables are smaller than what you'll find on an 05 STI because there was less room and things had to be shrunk a little bit just to make it work. So I think some of it comes down to space, some of it comes down to Cobb tries to develop really full, complete features where, for example, their flex fuel is just laid out in a way where it's like, here's everything, we figured it all out, just punch your numbers in and it's going to work great. Where I think ECUTek goes more on the side of, we're going to give you a lot of flexibility for you to choose how you want to do it. And I think in some ways that allows for a bit more creativity, but it certainly requires a lot more effort and understanding on the part of the tuner. So I think there's kind of pros and cons to both approaches. If you're basically operating a shop where you're trying to get as many cars done as possible in the most efficient manner, then I think the Cobb way, where everything is kind of done for you and handed on a silver platter with a tuning guide and, here's what you got to do, I think that works great. But if you want to do something a little different, then I think ECUTek has some nice pros there too. And I think that'll be kind of a common thread as we get into talking about standalones too, because there are certain standalones where they're like, this is our way of doing fuel, and another one might allow you to do custom tables, that sort of thing. So I think that's kind of a common thread between some different reflash situations and some different standalone options. So for me, it's a maybe. I wouldn't use it on an STI because Cobb is just so darn good, but certainly use it on the BRZ Gen 1 and Gen 2.
Sweet. You get a maybe. All right, next one. HP tuners. Let's start with Sam. Sam, what's your take on HP tuners?
At this current time, I don't think it's the move for Subarus. If we're trying to keep the conversation Subaru centered, I think Cobb is, again, it would be on my list. It would be Cobb, ECUTek, open source, HP tuners in that order. So I just don't think it ever caught on. It came into the game too late. So for the applications that they're good on, like the domestic stuff, phenomenal. But for Subarus, there's better options for sure.
Okay, I'm gonna put an end. Graham, what you got?
Yeah, so I have an H-Tuner shirt on today. I do a lot of work using their software for C8 Corvettes and C7 and other applications that they're really strong with. I have looked at their Subaru product, and there was a moment where I even used it for one remote tune for a guy in Canada or something, and it was a pretty modern GR STI, and I kind of converted my map over, and I'm like, all right, let's give this a shot. And I went looking for the closed loop to open loop delay changeover tables, the things that like to break ringlands on EJ engines, and they weren't there at all. And I'm like, well, that's not great. So yeah, that's the problem, is that they don't have all the tables, they don't have all the knowledge, they don't have the years and years of experience that Cobb does. They're just trying to crack something out and make a buck on it. They're not really invested in it like Cobb is. So for me it's a no. It's not viable.
Mike, what do you got?
I'm going to give a +1 for Sam's comments. He pretty much said what I would have said.
Just nailed it, huh?
Yeah, again, I do use HP tuners. It works great for some other things. It would not be my choice for Subaru at this time.
Easy enough. All right, here's another one. It's an oldie but goodie. Every once in a while, you find them under carpets, and you go, what the F is happening? Graham's caught a few of these where we've been at 6-star or whatever when I was still working there. He's like, this car won't tune. It's doing crazy stuff. I don't know what's going on. I'll pull the carpet up, and there's a Turbo Excess UTEC from back in the day. So we're going to talk about Turbo Excess UTECs real quick. This was a kind of an ancient piggyback system that Turbo Excess released, and at one point, this was the pinnacle of Subaru tuning. But obviously things have changed. But Mike, we're going to let you start this one.
That's perfect, because this is what I started with. Yeah, in let's see, 2002, I think it came out.
Yeah, boy.
Yeah, that's where I started out, and they actually developed it a bit as as time went on. They added some additional features. I ended up doing some tunes where I would open source Reflash, injector characteristics and whatnot, and then do ignition timing with the UTEC, for example. And you could do these combinations of things, which were pretty darn effective for the day. They worked very well. I think this would be an example where some of the standalones of the day were definitely worse than doing a combination of a Reflash plus a UTEC. But in terms of what's available today, this is a very hard no.
Yep. Well, I got a feeling it isn't going to be too much different from the rest of the guys, but let's hear it. Graham, what's up? You big on the UTEC?
I've run into a few of these, trying to figure out, flashing an open source tune on an ECU and trying to understand why it's acting extremely bizarre. And then we peel back the carpet and there's one of those things. So I've never tuned it, don't have an experience with it, but obviously, yeah, at this point, that's a heck no.
Sam, what's up?
No. That's
okay. All right, I got a feeling this next one's going to be real fast, but it was brought up, and this is more of for the memes. Gruddy eManage. Have any of you guys even tuned on an eManage? All right, well, we got to start with you, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to kind of fall under the SAFC deal. The guys really, talked a bunch about how skewing signals causes issues. Sam specifically mentioned how it skews load, which impacts ignition timing, also cam timing if the engine has it. Yeah, there's really no place for that today. I think you either use a great reflash solution and you've got everything you need, or if you've got a race car, you can, reflash or standalone. Piggybacks, in my mind, don't really have a place anymore. So that's no.
Yep, we're gonna go with just hard no there. Sam, what's up? Great e-manage? You big on the e-manage?
So, it was kind of one of my first after the SAFC. It was kind of my first experiences with tuning outside of the standalone. I started personally with Megasquirt. We'll talk about that later.
Yep.
But the eManage actually took the SAFC and brought it up to a little bit of a higher level when they released their eManage Ultimate. Because at that point, the eManage Ultimate actually had the ability to connect directly to your injectors. And so it could control the fuel almost directly. And so the only thing that you were really trying to spoof was the ignition timing by skewing the load. So it was an almost engine management.
No, we're getting to that.
It was an almost engine management solution that was still very much a piggyback, but it was the evolution of the piggyback. And I think Graham mentioned earlier at the beginning of the podcast that there's still solutions out there that are piggyback solutions for like the GR86s and newer BRZs like the CNA and all those cars. I think that's where that stemmed from. The fact that those are available right now is because the eManage Ultimate was one of the first ones to basically take the piggyback and kind of shove it a little bit towards a standalone while not having a full standalone or a full reflash.
Graham?
Nope, thumbs down. Haven't seen it, don't care, not interested.
Nice. All right. Now we're going to get into some of the more, these are more standalone. These are we'll call them entry-level standalones, okay? This is right when you're creeping into it. Some of these are very capable, and there's some people who may even argue that these are not entry-level standalones, but for the most part, it's kind of what they are. Let's start with Megasquirt. And since Sam, he started with Megasquirt, why don't we start with him? Sam, what's your take on Megasquirt, bud?
My first experience with Megasquirt, I was aware that there was other versions of it. My first experience was with a Megasquirt 2. Megasquirt 2 was a very simple project that it started as a sort of DIY-ish. If you that are listening, that's a recent creation that is similar to what Megasquirt once was. Megasquirt, the misconception is that it used to be open source. It never was. It was owned by the people that wrote the code. They just had the code open so that you could see what the code was about, but you had to license it to be able to use it on something else. So that's the very big distinction between something that's open source and something that is not. They can go after you if you use it in a different hardware environment. So they basically wrote the code and they put it into a hardware package. Now, there was other people out there that believed that they could build better hardware, and so they built different hardware packages and they licensed the Megasquirt code for use with that hardware. Now, as far as it pertains to Subarus, I have experience with Megasquirts on Subarus, and they can control pretty much every Subaru. The only thing that they cannot control is the dual AVCS Subarus on the exhaust side. They can do the intake AVCS cars, but they can do drive-by-wire. There's no version of Megasquirt out there that can do drive-by-wire. So if you are going to put a Subaru on Megasquirt, then you have to eliminate drive-by-wire. They actually do have a plug-and-play version of one of their ECUs for the 02 to 05 WRXs, which didn't come with drive-by-wire. They were drive-by-cable. They work fine. They're not the best ECU. They do have a bunch of functions and features like every other standalone ECU out there. They're obviously lacking in a lot of departments, drive-by-wire included, and that's kind of a crucial thing for a lot of people that are looking to get into a standalone ECU on their Subaru. But they work. You know, they have their application. To this day and age, I would not spend the money on a Megasquirt to put it on a Subaru. I think there's better options out there for the same money. Um, and we'll talk about those options later. But it's possible to run a Subaru. If you're doing, I would say Megasquirt is a maybe for me in the very particular application where you're doing something like a retrofit of a Subaru engine, an old Subaru single cam 6/7 trigger Subaru engine into something like a Volkswagen Vanagon or Bug or something like that, and you just want, or like a sand rail or something like that. The Megasquirt would probably be a really good budget, even though there are other options out there that can fit within the same price range. But that's the only use case that I would use it on. If you already have a Megasquirt and you're doing this kind of retrofit and you want to keep the Megasquirt and you don't want to sell it, then you can put it on one of those cars. But as far as like being competitive with it and whatnot, you're just kind of like bragging that you're able to do whatever with that ECU at that point. It's not really because the ECU is like better
That's
or
kind of
very
always
good.
been what I got out of Megasquirts was people just bragging the fact they managed to get something to run on a Megasquirt. So, Graham,
Yeah,
what's your take
yeah.
on Megasquirt?
Yeah, to be honest, like I've looked at it very, very, very briefly. You know, got asked about a project that had it and kind of looked at it, did some research on it, and decided that it just wasn't going to be something that I wanted to invest in a lot of time in learning because I didn't want to do more of it. So it's something that I've just skipped and passed on. So I don't have any feedback on it. I'll rely on Sam and say that it's a nay for Subaru. You know, it didn't make sense.
Mike, what's up? Big Megasquirt guy, huh?
No. Yeah, no, I've done a few to help friends out. I usually don't enjoy the process too much. They certainly can work though. And it's one of those situations where if you invest enough time into it in a particular hardware set and matching software, kind of like Sam mentioned, there's a lot of things that people will call Megasquirt kind of under the umbrella that are a bit different in terms of hardware or which version of software you can use with it. And depending on that, your experience might differ a bit. So I did a few for a company. I won't mention the name because it's not important, but there was this company that had kind of used Megasquirt and kind of made their own take on software. And they were kind of popular with Audi guys. I did a few of those. And the cars ran, you know. It wouldn't have been my choice, but it did work. In terms of a Subaru, it's going to be a no for me. And I think Sam was trying to, you know, give Megasquirt folks some hope, like, hey, there might be this Subaru van type project that might make sense for. And I agree, you know, kind of like open source. Like if you're learning, you're doing a DIY thing, you don't want to put a ton of money into it, it could certainly work. In my mind, if I'm going to pay to replace an ECU, though, I'm going to pay a few $100 more and probably get something else. So for me, it's a no.
So BJ at PDRE said this perfect. Megasquirt is a unicycle. Doesn't make any sense to use, but some people like to show everyone that they can. That is a really good way of putting that.
Yeah.
BJ, you win, bud. That's comment of the day so far.
If I can say one thing about Megasquirt that I'm appreciative of, having learned on that platform how to tune, is that it's very raw. And what I mean by that is that you have to understand the very, very, very nitty-gritty fundamentals of setting up a standalone ECU to make the car run in the first place to be able to get that car to run. And that is something that you don't learn when you're doing Reflash, and that's your first and only like source of experience. You don't know what a trigger pattern is, you don't know where a trigger angle is, you don't know what trigger offsets are, you don't know how to correlate your cam to your crank. Like, you 9 times out of 10 tuners that have only done Reflash in their life, that have never done uh any standalone ECU tuning, they don't know how to use a timing light. And that's like a very simple, like essential skill to be able to be a tuner, just like reading spark plugs back in the day used to be. And it still is very relevant. You still need to read spark plugs, especially in very high horsepower builds and stuff like that, where you want to know if you're what's happening actually inside the combustion chamber without having an actual camera in there. I think that's what Megasquirt taught me the most, was being able to learn the very, very nitty-gritty fundamentals that now I can hop onto a more complex system and I can figure out how their trigger setup works, because it's different from ECU to ECU. And as long as you know your fundamentals, and that applies to everything in tuning, is if you know the fundamentals of how fueling works in an engine, in a port injected engine or direct injected engine, whatever that may be, then you're able to use any system. It just takes a little bit of time for you to understand how they implemented that in their software and their ECU itself. So I that's why I give Megasquirt a maybe, just because I have a little bit of a soft spot, because it was like a school for me. Like, I learned how to tune on a very raw, very like the manual is the documentation for Megasquirt is like no other. Like, the documentation on Megasquirt is amazing. It goes down to very, very nitty-gritty details, and that helped me become the tuner that I am today. And that's why I think I have a preference for standalone ECUs and standalone ECU tuning, is because I'm not scared of that. I can hop into any system that you give me and figure it out, and get any car to run on any ECU. And if I can't get it to run, I can tell you exactly why. Like, maybe the trigger wheels are wrong and you have a wrong combination, stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like, the very like deep understanding of what makes an engine run, especially a port injected, EFI engine, um, is what Megasquirt taught me. That's what I learned on it.
So basically, people who can ride a unicycle will probably be really good on a bicycle. Got it.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Next, FuelTech. I don't know how much you guys have messed with FuelTech too much. You're a little new on the scene here in the States. I heard, are they like based out of Brazil? Am I right or wrong about that? Either way, FuelTech, I know they're pretty big in some of the drag scene, but as far as Subaru guys in general, I don't know much about it. I think I'm going to start with Graham on this one.
So yeah, I've looked at FuelTech. They were boasting a, kind of like a C8 solution for a while. So I kind of looked at it with that. I've also looked at it for kind of like interesting little projects, because they've got kind of a cool ECU that's also like your LCD screen. So I was like, that could be cool, like in a side-by-side or something. It's not something that I would by any means consider for a Subaru. It from what I could gather, their experience and their knowledge is more around V8s. Not imports. So if you're gonna get into Subarus, you really have to invest in Subarus to have an ECU that's going to work well for it. Especially if we're talking about the newer stuff that has CAN bus, you're going to have to do all that stuff to make all that work. So for me, it's a no, just simply because they're not really focused on the Subaru platform. I think it's a neat product, but not for Subarus.
Mike, what's your take?
Yeah, I think my understanding of their target market, and from talking to them at trade shows, is a little bit similar to Holly. I would say, where they're trying to attract an audience that maybe isn't quite as savvy and may not have as an in-depth an understanding of tuning. So they want to make things really easy to get set up and running, kind of the opposite of what Sam was describing, having to figure out on a Megasquirt. Make it really easy to figure out, set up triggering, just pick your engine and, tell it what kind of cam you have, and we'll have the engine running in a few minutes, which is a great thing. I think where that kind of falls down, or where the limitation of it is if you are a capable tuner and you want to tune something precisely, they're not really designed for that. They're designed to get up running quickly, running decent, driving, not perfect. And I think one of the things that shocked me when I looked at the ECU with one of their guys at a trade show in the last year was the fuel table is still just a fuel number. It's not even a VE table. And for me, I think if a standalone ECU is going in a car and it's not using a VE model, it's not for me. That's just kind of like bare bones, fundamentally just below a level that I kind of want to get involved with and bring my customers into. So for me, that's a no, particularly on a Subaru, because not only is it less capable than others, it's also not plug and play. So why do it?
Sam, what you got?
There's a lot to unpack about FuelTech, but I'm going to try to be as concise as possible. Um, First and foremost, I need to open when it comes to FuelTech. FuelTech is an ECU that was created by Brazilian drag racers for Brazilian drag racers. Okay? What that means is it is a absolutely capable ECU when it comes to staging, launch control, going down the quarter mile, shutting down. That is what that ECU is made for. Otherwise, probably has some sort of bias. They probably sell a lot of them. Like Mike said, the ECU is pulse width based. You don't tune a torque model on the engine. You don't tune a airflow model on the engine like VE is. You just basically do a, hey, open the injector for this long when the RPM and the boost is this much. What that means is it's not repeatable. Now, what FuelTech did really, really good was they implemented the things that band-aided those shortcomings in a very, very good, robust, and efficient way. For example, their nano widebands are phenomenal. They are awesome, and they keep making updates on them. Now they have like a touch screen that you can have like inputs and outputs on the touchscreen itself. It's stuff that looks really great at a trade show when you see it lit up on a stand. And when you see an in-camera video of a car with a FuelTech, you see the screen pop up and all that stuff and whatnot. And that's the other thing, the screen. Oh my God, you don't know how many people just buy FuelTech because they don't want to wire 2 wires to run their tack in their car. And the tack is on the screen. So why do you want to make your tack work? Your water temperature, why would you want to wire your water temperature sensor to your tack again? Like that's the thing with FuelTech. FuelTech is a race car ECU. It's really good at drag race car ECU. It's what it does. The launch control is amazing. It's one of the few things that ECU has that is very tightly powerful. It uses most of the processing power in the ECU, to be honest. Like it's all closed loop PID based launch control, targets on RPM, targets a boost. The boost control is another thing. It's phenomenal. You can use solenoids, you can use CO2, you can use e-gates by using one of their power drivers and run the TurboSmart e-gates, and you just literally they have it developed so well that you do a base pull on like a low psi and it figures out what the actual opening on the e-gate is going to be, and then you just tell it give me 40 psi and it closed loop goes to 40 psi. It works great for drag racing. For a Subaru, that's a different story. There is one Subaru out there that I know of in Colorado that is running I think 8 seconds, and he's on a FuelTech. Now the main shortcoming of FuelTech, I think, is if your engine is not inherently supported inside the software, getting your engine to run with one of the generic setups is a task because you have to integrate some kind of universal trigger wheel, and then as I talk about Megasquirt, you have to understand how to set up a trigger system to make that engine run, and that's something that you have to do with Subarus, as far as I know, with FuelTech. I haven't been I haven't used the FuelTech in the recent like couple years when it comes to a Subaru, but that's how it used to be a couple years ago. There wasn't any 36 minus 2, 3-tooth cam setup on the FuelTech that could run the stock uh, trigger setup and the stock AVCS. I know as far as recently they implemented 2JC VVTi, which is one of the simplest forms of VVTi that there is, and it's actually shared in a way with Subaru. It's very similar in how it's set up. So it's capable of running AVCS because they could run the 2JC VVTi, but it's not I wouldn't say it's a go-to option for Subarus unless you're exclusively intending to run a e-gate methanol drag race Subaru with a custom trigger setup. Then it's a really good option. But there's other options out there that can do just as good, if not better, and keep the car, where you don't have to like have a useless dash in the back, like behind the screen on the FuelTech. So There's a lot of other things I could go into, but obviously we're limited on time and we still have a lot to
Yes.
get through. So,
So is that, I'm going to call that a no.
yeah, no. On Subarus,
Okay.
no.
We're going to try to burn through a couple of these here real quick. Holly, we'll start with Mike. You're muted.
I'll put it in the same category as ECUTek, where I think they really focused on a certain market, which is not Subaru.
Well, there you go. Graham?
Yep, not for this platform.
Sam?
What was that again?
Holly?
Sorry? Holly? No. Keep
right.
going.
All right. Let's do another one. This is borderline a meme. Hydra. Let's start with Graham.
No, negative. I think I've seen it maybe once a long time ago, and it just no. I don't. Yeah,
there was a particular tuner who pushed the crap out of this at one point. I don't know if he still is. That's the only time I've seen it, but I don't know. Sam?
Hydra? I haven't heard that name in a long time. That's a no for me, dog.
Mike, what do you got?
That's a no. I did use a couple very long time ago. There were a number of issues and with hardware and software, and that would not be something I would suggest.
All right. This one we probably get a hair more in depth on, because I've seen this on cars and functioning, but it's kind of on Subaru specifically. Honda guys love this. AEM, specifically their Series 2 or their what is their new, the Infinity, which I know are both, they're kind of different products, but their software is set up fairly similar. I don't know. Let's start with Mike.
All right. There was a period of time where it was pretty early days for Cobb, and the Reflash plus UTEC option got you certain things but not others. And the Series 2 had just come out, kind of like around, it was either 05 or 06. And at the time, because it was plug and play, which again is a big factor, a lot of customers don't want to pay for custom wiring. So I can't really think of any other plug and plays that you could buy around then for like an 05, 06 STI besides Link, which we'll probably talk about at some point. So I'd say that combined with AEM having tons of marketing power and everybody knowing them from their intakes and various other things, gauges and whatnot, they had tons of brand recognition. People were definitely going to try this product. And I'd say they were successful in other markets. They definitely struggled with some things specific to the triggering on Subarus. I don't know if the other guys ran into this, but we definitely ran into some situations where the ECU would fail to properly detect triggering at high RPM, which would scatter the timing, fire the quills off time, and do lots of damage. And it did get to a point where AEM recognized the issue, but I think it wasn't necessarily fully resolved in a manner that some of us were satisfied with, and for that reason, I think some of us got away from it, at least in terms of the Subaru application. Also, I would say that AEM's development of that product continued for a while, but then mostly stopped. And I'd say that other companies have continued their development and really kind of just taken things a few steps beyond. So at one time, it was something to consider using. I would say today, no.
All right, big no. How about it, Graham? You big AEM guy there?
Yeah, it is almost engine management.
Yeah.
Almost. Yeah, it's kind of important to know where your ignition timing is at, and that is the deal breaker for me when I came to understand what Mike said there, where it couldn't really keep track of where the engine was, and so the timing would drift. And on some engines, maybe that's, you can get away with that. Naturally aspirated stuff, sure. But a turbo Subaru engine, no, it's extremely important. Your timing is where you think it is. So between that and just like the clunky software, I worked with some Infinities and I really disliked some of the clunkiness of the software. And, ultimately I tried a couple projects with it. It's a definite no for me.
Sam, what do you got?
AM. Before anybody says anything about them, when it comes to Subarus, it still holds the record for the quickest Subaru, AM V2 specifically. But again, drag racing, it's its own thing, right? And it doesn't take much to get a car from point A to point B in a straight line. So pretty much any ECU can do it, as long as you are able to run the engine in the first place. So I'm gonna put that out of the way. I think AEM got really popular on the Subaru market early on because I think they were correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they were one of the first ones to offer like a link style plugin, where it had the connectors built into the ECU itself, and you could literally just pop it in and go, and it was already like preloaded with a map that could start the car. And this was for the earlier 02 to 05 WRXs with the 36 -2 and the two teeth on the cam. And I'm willing to bet that the main issue that they had with the ignition timing was because of the trigger wheel on the Subaru is it's an odd trigger wheel, and I think that ECU was better designed because of the processing power and whatnot to be used with a single tooth missing trigger wheel like a 36 -1 or 60 -2, something like that. And I think that's where some of that issue with the timing drift and stuff came on, just because they couldn't track the RPM in the right way. But it's old, it's very outdated. Just recently I saw a video, I think it was from PFI Speed. They were tuning a AM Infinity Evo or something, and it like glitched out the software, and it stuck every output closed, so everything was on, so all the injectors were open, the fuel pump was open, and it just flushed everything with fuel because the ECU, like you had to literally like pull the battery off because it was keyed off, and everything was grounded and powered and on. And like stuff like that, I think, is what steered people away from AM. So that's pretty much everything I have to say about it.
All right, big nah. All right. Next, ECU Masters. I'm gonna let Sam open this one.
ECUMaste, I've used it on Subarus. I've used personally the ECUMaste Black. They recently released their EMU Pro. I have no experience with that software or hardware. I would say the ECUMaste Black on a AVCS and drive-by-wire Subaru, like an early 32-bit car, it's an acceptable ECU. If you brought me a car with an ECUMaste on like a 05, 06, 07 STI, I would tune it. It's good, and it has good launch control features and stuff. And they recently introduced like a simple like ref match feature where it just blips the throttle a certain percentage and stuff like that. Like it's a pretty decent ECU for the money. It has a built-in wideband, and it's all like $1,200. There's no plug and play option for the Subaru at this time. You would have to get an adapter custom made. I've actually made one recently for a guy local that wanted to put a EMU Black on an 06 STI. And it works. There's nothing wrong with it. I think it's a good ECU for the money. Like if all you have is $1,200 for an ECU, that's your budget on the project. It's good. It's a good option.
So that's a yes if it fits the situation. Okay, Graham.
So yeah, I've done some ECUMaste tuning, but not with a Subaru. It's been 1JZ, did like a 1JZ project. I did the other thing, some RB engine projects with it. So I've used their ECU a fair amount. I'd say maybe, I don't know, 6 to 8 projects I've used. The EMU class. What?
Did you break up, or did my internet crap?
I don't know. You guys hear me okay?
It was me as in, okay, so yeah, that was me. Okay, continue on.
So yeah, so I've done 6 to 8 projects with it, non-Subaru stuff. It's an okay ECU to use. It's not one of my favorites, and I wouldn't be inclined to recommend it for a Subaru, just simply personally because of it's not my favorite to work with. I don't necessarily like all the way they do things. Like Sam said, it's a good ECU for the money. It's a good ECU for a simple application. I don't think they have any CAN bus support, so it's going to be a no-go on the 08 plus cars that need CAN bus integration. So for me, it's going to be kind of a no for Subarus, just because of lack of integration and something that I wouldn't want to work with.
Mike, what do you got?
All right, my experience is similar to these guys, where I've used the ECUMaste's Black, but not the Pro. So I don't want to shortchange them if it's incredible. I just haven't used it. I will also say that I absolutely love ECUMaste PDMs. I think they're absolutely phenomenal. So I just want to say that before I say that I'm not a huge fan of the ECU. So, for example, today I was bench testing a Motec dash with a Link ECU and ECUMaste PDM and keypad. So I do mix it up a bit, and there's certain products from certain brands which I think are phenomenal. So PDM, fantastic. ECU, I'm not as big a fan of. And I would say that because it comes in at a price point where there are other options that I love, I don't think it makes sense. So Sam also mentioned it's not plug and play for the car. By the time you do a wiring piggyback harness, typically you've spent similar or more money to something like a Link, which I would choose to use instead. So for that reason, for me, it's a no, but not a no on ECUMasters entirely, because their PDMs are phenomenal.
Yeah, we're running their PDM. We're running 2 of their PDMs in Boogie along with Emtron ECU, and their PDMs are sick. Their new dash is sick. They got a lot of really cool products. So even though maybe the ECU doesn't quite hit the exact mark for most Subaru owners, their product line is really, really good. So, all right. Well, now we're gonna take it up a little bit further. We're gonna get into these are probably 2 that are gonna get, when people talk about standalone ECUs, these are probably the 2 that get brought up the most. Outside of something like, say, maybe like a Motec, but like these are the 2 that I let's call them attainable. The first one we're going to talk about is Haltech. If we got to have this conversation. Man, who do we want to start with? Who's going to be the least spicy? Let's start with Graham.
Least spicy. Okay. All right. See what I can do here. So yeah, I mean, I have what I would say is a significant amount of experience working with Haltech. I've tried a number of Subarus tuned, somewhere between maybe, I don't know, at least 10, 15 cars I can think of. So not a ton, but I also don't do a lot of standalone tunings. It's, not a lot of race cars out there, but I've spent many, many hours on it. Obviously, one of those cars being, your car, when we were, before we switched to the Emtron. So
we won a championship on it.
Yeah, we won a championship on it. There's a lot of good things about it. I've also used it. I have some guy, Peter has it in his K24 BRZ, and he's winning every event. So in some applications, I really do like Haltech, and in Subaru applications, I haven't been as happy with it. The data logging for me is extremely painful. You can't log nearly fast enough or nearly enough things. I also personally don't feel like it's not as powerful at tracking the engine and running the engine as smoothly as I see with other ECUs. I don't want to try to go into a lot of detail on that, because I don't fully understand the electronical reasons of it. People smarter than me have explained it to me, and it's still kind of over my head, but for me, I haven't felt like it's the best fit. I know it's become kind of popular. Some other people on YouTube have made it popular for different reasons, but for me, it's a pretty good ECU. I won't turn it down. I do work with some cars that have it, but it can be a struggle. It can be a struggle to get cars to do simple things like idle smoothly and drive around smoothly. Whereas when I work with other ECUs, they have a better way of calculating the airflow around idle and making that much more like an OEM to work with. Haltech's kind of one of those ones where, the more time and the more hours and the more fiddling with it, you can get it to work better and better, but you have to kind of fight to get there. Whereas other ECUs that I work with are much more intuitive to get to where you want to get. So for me, it's It's not my first choice. It's something I will work with if a car already has it, but presently I don't recommend it over others that I feel work a lot better.
So, do you want me to put a maybe or a no?
I mean, if you're going to come to me and ask me, should I buy this and I'm going to tune with you, my answer is no. If you already have it on your car and the rest of your setup is good and everything's okay, I'm not going to say, oh, you have to get rid of it for me to tune your car. So I will tune it if it's on the car and the setup makes sense. I will not sell it to you or recommend it. If you don't have anything already, I'll sell you something else, if that makes sense.
Are you leaning more towards no or maybe?
I guess no. I don't think it's the best choice. So no.
Okay. That's fair. Man, who? Let's do Mike first.
All right, so I'm gonna just call this the $1,000 to $2,000 good quality consumer grade to starting to get into motorsport grade type stuff. So we're talking about Haltech, AEM, the ECUMaste, Link, stuff like that. Haltech does a phenomenal job of marketing. Everyone knows the name. And I think that at different periods of time over the years, their product strength compared to the other brands has kind of gone up and down. So I think there were periods of time where, for example, in the early 2000s, I remember tuning an E6K, I think it was called, for a guy that had put a turbo kit on a Tiburon. And at the time, like, I had tuned, some, it was like, are we going to do a Motec like M4 on this? Or are we going to do this Haltech? And the Haltech got the job done. It was solid, it wasn't incredible, but for the day it was good. And then there was a point where they came out with the Platinum series. And I think when that came out, they worked a few kinks out. And for a few years, it was a really strong product. And then I think with the Elite and then the AEM Infinity, those were kind of overlapping. I think they tried to modernize and add a ton of features. And then I think it took a while for them to really iron a lot of stuff out. And there was a period of time where perhaps certain things were a bit quirky. And if you kind of waited that period out, then it became more stable. I think we're kind of at that point now where with their NSP software, things have stabilized, things have improved. I think they always had kind of like AEM, a really good bullet point list of features. Like if you're just looking at a website, like does this ECU tick these boxes? It's going to tick the boxes for sure. But then it's a matter of, how well does each feature function compared to another ECU? And I think for me, I think Haltech more recently has been refining those things and improving them. And for me, it's still not my choice in that price range. It's going to be Link, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But they've definitely gotten closer. And I got to give Haltech a shout out because we won Pikes Peak Open Class this year with a Haltech equipped car, and we were the fastest American team on Pikes Peak. So, that the thing clearly works. It does have safety features. It does do try-by-wire, variable cam, all that stuff. Has all that functionality. So I'm going to be in a similar situation to Graham here, where if you ask me what to buy, that's probably not what I would tell you to get. But if you have it now, and I do have someone recently that talked me into giving it a shot on an STI road race car, we used it. There are certain features that work well. There's certain ones where I kind of wish I had something else on it, but the car's getting the job done. So for me, I'm going to give it a maybe.
All right, you get a maybe. Sam, what's up?
There's a lot to say. I think I will start out by adding on to what Graham and Mike both said. I think it's a capable ECU. I think that I'm glad to see, especially on the internet, on Facebook forums and stuff like that. I'm glad to see that the saying has picked up and has been become more mainstream, where people ask what ECU to use, and the first thing that gets said now is like, talk to your tuner, talk to the person that's going to tune it. I think that goes a long way. If you're going to talk to a guy that specializes in Haltech and sells Haltech, and it's the only thing that he wants to use, he's probably going to be really good at it. And he's probably going to get your car up and running really well, and you're going to be able to win competitions and stuff with the ECU. And if the ECU does what you need it to do, it'll do it. Now, is it the best option out there, especially in the Subaru platform? I don't think so. I think at some point it used to be probably one of the best ones. But nowadays I think there's other ECUs that have gone above and beyond what Haltech is capable of. When it comes to running a Subaru in any kind of environment, whether that's a super high strung drag engine or super high strung time attack car, or like a street car of some sort that you're doing like drag and drive with, maybe, or whatever. But I if you ask me what ECU to use on a Subaru, I would recommend. I wouldn't recommend Haltech. If you brought me a car to tune with a Haltech, I would happily tune it, and I'm completely capable of doing so. So it's a good ECU, and it can do what it needs to do. It can win events. Mike said it. You won with Boogie, with Graham behind the keyboard, on a Haltech. So it's not bad. There's definitely way worse options out there. I think it all comes down to tuner preference mainly, budget, and if the feature set of the Haltech specifically that you're looking at includes the things that you needed to do for your particular application. One of those examples is, let's say that you wanted to hit a button that just targets a certain torque. Can't do that with Haltech. It's not something that's built into the ECU. So and to just of insight as well, I think what I'm saying is probably, and what we're all saying here, I think is going to be valid maybe within the next certain time period, because a few years ago even the Elite wasn't what it is now, and that is because they bought another company called Adaptronic, and they bought the brains behind that company, Andy Wyatt, and that's the person that implemented the new. He built essentially the Nexus ECU, the Nexus architecture, and then he retrofitted that into the Elite to make it what it is now, and that's what you actually won Grit Life with. And that's probably what Mike used, was the NSP software into an Elite or something. So it's before that, Haltech was a completely different thing. Now, I would say it's a good option that can do what you need it to do if you want to opt for that. But there's definitely better options out there as far as the general control of a Subaru as a car, not just the engine.
All right. So, what do you want to call that, a maybe?
I guess, because if you bring it to me to tune it, I will tune it. If you ask me, hey, I'm building a car, I'm going to use this, like, what ECU should I use? I'm going to recommend something
This
else.
is why we needed a 1 to 10. All right? We should have did 0 to 10, but it's all right.
It's
I think that's a maybe, right? That's
we'll
the
call it
definition of maybe.
That's fine.
Yeah.
That's maybe. That's maybe. All right. We need to talk about Link Vipack now. Gotta happen. This is one of Link is Vipack no longer exists, but was a part of Link. So those of you who are listening in the Chicago area that were told specifically to only run a Vipack, Link is the same company. But Link has really came on, I would honestly say, in the past, say, 3 years, in the Subaru community, you started hearing a lot more about Link, and a lot of more mainline tuners that started messing with them. And I'm interested to hear you guys' thoughts. I'm not sure who we want to start with. I think we're going to start with Mike on this one.
All right. So I've been using Link for a very, very long time, and kind of like I just described Haltech. There were different points in time where, compared to other things in the price range, They were maybe more or less strong. Early 2000s, I would say, not the ideal product. And they brought the Vypec name out to kind of try to rebrand and build people's confidence back, because they built a whole new line of ECUs that was great and solved all sorts of problems, but I think some people were concerned to use it. So called the company Vypec for a few years, put out great products, everybody was happy, and then they were like, oh, by the way, this has been Link all the time, and we're just going to call it Link again. And so that's where we're at now. My old Time Attack car ran that ECU. So it was 2 generations old now for most of when I was racing the car, and then 1 generation old when we finished that car up around 2014. Super capable. I really enjoy that Link gives you the flexibility to have tons of custom tables, change axes, change, your method of doing everything, essentially. If you want to tune throttle based instead of map based, you can do that. If you want your boost control to be based on something that has nothing to do with boost, you can do that, which I actually do for certain applications. You have tons of capability to use your own creativity, develop your own strategies and functionality. And that's all on top of a base of really well thought out and complete features. The other thing they do really well is, they'll put an ECU hardware out for a certain number of years, but as it's out, they're continuing to develop software and firmware and just make it better and better, add features as they go. So when you buy a product, it's not kind of set in stone and you got what you got and it'll never get better. It's absolutely going to get better. It's always been the way with them. So for example, a few years ago, if somebody came to me and said, hey, I want to paddle shift a sequential transmission, I would have been telling them, we're going to do Motec for sure. Today, it's going to be, we could use a Link and it's going to work phenomenal. We could also use a Motec. We could also use an Emtron. But Link isn't excluded from that now because that feature set got really good. So I think they do a ton of things better than the other ECUs in the $1,000 to $2,000 category. For me, a project has to really have a need that's very critical to go beyond that price range. I don't take selling someone a $4,000+ ECU lightly. So if we're going to be talking about Motec Emtron, which is kind of that next step up in price, I really have to know, all right, there's got to be something they want or need that the Link can't do, and there isn't a ton that it can't do. So I think I've also really enjoyed working with the software because you can fully configure and template all of your pages of how you calibrate, view live data, and review recorded log data. So the more time you spend with it, the more you can make it exactly work the way you want it to. So I think it's very rewarding for people who really go deep into it, for sure. And they have plug and play options, right? So when we're talking about Subaru, they have plugins all the way back to a 93 Impreza WRX, and all the way up to a 21 STI now they just recently came out with. So they have all the STIs covered, all the WRXs that are not direct injected. They also have Gen 1 BRZ plug and play. So massive plug and play coverage, all under $2,000. So I think that alone puts them really far up the list in terms of Subaru specifically, just because your total cost and your ease of install is phenomenal. They also have the CAN integration, so you're going to have your SI drive, you're going to be able to get wheel speeds over CAN on the newer cars, all that sort of stuff. So I could go on for hours about how much I like Link, but in the $1,000 to $1,000 range, that is my hell yes, definitely the one to go with.
Sam, what's your take on Link?
I've used Link on Subarus. I like it. I've used Linked on other cars as well. I think it's really good, especially like way Mike said for the money. Now on the plugin aspect of it, the one thing I don't like about Link plugins, even though the price point is very attractive, um, as a guy that does wiring for a living, I like being able to control what I/O is assigned to what, and that's something I don't get with a Link plugin. The plugins they make a box for you, and if you fit inside that box, it's a really good option. Especially if you have a tuner like Mike that's very versed in Link ECU, and you want the car to do a certain thing, right? Now, as far as I/O goes, those plugins tend to be limited in the I/O department. They have expansion ports where they add different inputs and different outputs in some cases. But it's ultimately limited by the core ECU that is being used to create the plugin in the first place, which I believe on the Subarus they're based on the Extreme, if I'm not mistaken. Um, so the Extreme is similar to a Haltech Elite. It's got two connectors. It's similar to Emtron SL series or similar to a Motec M130. It's got two connectors, so you're limited by the amount of I/O that is physically on the board on the ECU that fits on there. Um, as far as how it pertains to a Subaru, it will start, run, idle. It will integrate the whole CAN bus on the car, and you'll have all those. So going back to the Haltech topic, and I don't want to make this Haltech versus Link. Back before they did the update, before on the newer Subarus, you have the SI drive switch. That didn't do anything on the Haltech. It's always done something on the Link. You've always been able to use that SI drive as an input in the ECU, and it was until recently when they implemented that on the Haltech that now you can, which was kind of silly, I think. It's a CAN bus based input that gives you three positions, right? So why would you not be able to use it in the ECU as part of some kind of custom feature that you want to build into it? So it's definitely a great ECU when it comes to the to running a Subaru, and they just released, like Mike said, they just released the newer model STI support. So that applies for the in the USDM particularly applies for the 11 to 21 STIs. And I'm sure with their new G5 stuff, soon enough we'll see something for the FAs as well. Since they just released DI support for the G5 series. It's probably going to be expensive, but it's not going to be, probably I don't expect it to be as expensive as a Motec M142 or something like that. The price points are definitely different, and the feature sets are different as well. So I think Link is definitely a solid contender in that like higher grade consumer level ECU, and it can go toe to toe with a lot of the motorsports entry level motorsports ECUs. Um, it's priced very well. You have all kinds of devices that you can use. One of the things I liked the most that Link did right from the get-go was their CAN bus implementation. You can write custom CAN bus code within the ECU and do OEM level CAN bus integration. So you can basically run a car that has a relatively simple CAN bus because you're limited on the number of channels that you can use. But you can take a car that has a relatively simple CAN bus and make everything CAN bus on the car work from the ECU. You don't need an external box like a CAN bus gateway or anything like that. And if you're savvy enough that you can reverse engineer a CAN bus network, then you can implement it on Link. And that's something that Link has that I wish that other ECUs that cost more did have, and I hope to see it at some point. Because I think it's a really good feature to have for people that are trying to make otherwise factory cars race cars.
All right, so I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Graham, I know you're a fan. What do you say?
So Link's become one of our absolute favorite ECUs. We're running one in our 2.5 RS. It has the 07 STI swap in it, so I've got one in a personal vehicle. Spent many hours on it, working with it, and yeah, it's been great. For me, it's become the perfect bridge the gap between a stock ECU with Cobb and you're ready to take your car to the track and race it, but just kind of more as an enthusiast, more maybe HPDE, kind of working your way up, or you don't really ever plan to try to be super competitive or build to the level of car like you have, for example, but you want something that's going to keep the car safer on the track by monitoring oil pressure, coolant pressure, things like that, and give you some safeties. That's when we recommend it and sell it, because it is, like the other guy said, it's an extremely good value. In part, just the way they've been able to price it because of how it's built, largely and due to the fact that it doesn't require a wiring harness. You can just plug it right in and you're good to go. Now, to Sam's point, that does limit you on some of the I/O. So, if the conversation's like, well, I want turbo dynamics and I want to be able to, have anti-surge tuning, we'll go get to that. But if you want some of these higher level features, you're not going to be able to do that with a Link. But if you want something that's going to be more powerful than a stock ECU, but you're not trying to do competition with it, it is an incredible bang for the buck. And to me, it's very easy to work with. It's very nice to work with. It runs the engine extremely smooth for its price point too. The data logging is actually quite good too. People can, if I'm working with these cars remotely, someone can just simply go out and drive the car as I ask them to and send me the ECU log, and it's got fast data and it's got all the things I need to be able to see exactly how the engine's running and give them a quick update. So it's nice to work with both on the dyno and remotely. So yeah, it's been fantastic for me, and it's one of the first one of the main ECUs that we recommend and sell and tune right now.
That sounds like a big yes. But I do have a question. Can you tune oil pressure tables with either of these?
Like raise the oil pressure?
Yeah. Can you add the oil pressure to it with it?
No. Yeah. And there are some limitations in the firmware with Link that get a little frustrating for me. One of the ones I've bitched about before was, the launch control is, kind of a singular model, and you can choose for it to be rolling launch control, or you can choose for it to be stationary launch control. You can't really do both. You can kind of work around it by setting up the primary launch control to be rolling, and then kind of make like a user-defined stationary launch that creates a rev limiter, but it's not quite as dynamic and clean that way. So I've had a few Subarus that were frustrated by that, because they're cars that they're high enough horsepower that they want to go roll racing, but once in a while they also want to launch off the street, and I have to give them two maps and say, sorry, you got to flash your stationary launch map or your rolling launch map. Not a huge deal, but that's been kind of annoying. There's another little thing I found too, maybe Mike's seen it, where if someone does if you're using full-time fuel control and someone does a flat foot shift, there's like a hard-coded 1 second delay before the closed loop fuel kicks back in. I found that, told them about it, and they're like, oh yeah, that is hard-coded. I'm like, could you just expose that so we can tune it? But, few shortcomings like that in the firmware that have annoyed me a little bit, but it's been otherwise fantastic.
Well, that sounds like a fairly glowing review for Link.
Sam's got something.
Stan, what you got?
I think I we're, for those that are listening to the podcast, we're seeing each other's faces in this, Mike, Graham, and I. So I saw Graham when he said something about the I think it was the shifting and whatnot. Like the Link can do that. So it's not that it can't. Remember the podcast, we're specifically talking about how Link pertains in the Subaru sphere, and especially when you're talking about the plugins. Because what I said was the plugins are limited in the I/O, so that limits you in like the aspect of what stuff you can control and what you can't based on what you have available physically on the ECU. That's not to say that you can grab a G5 and make a wiring adapter harness and then just run whatever you want. But since we're talking about the budget and the price point, the plugins are where the bang for buck is. Once you start talking about making the ECU, like putting the ECU in the same price range as the other options where you have to use a patch harness to be able to install them in the car, then I think that kind of goes out the window. And it just becomes, in my opinion, it's not as full featured as an ECU where you have to use a patch harness like an M130, M150, or an Emtron SL or a KV. So that's I think that's a distinction that was worth making. And Mike, you can go ahead and add to that or take away from that however you see fit. But I thought it was a worthwhile distinction to make.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth mentioning. I just want to give people kind of a general idea of where that limit is, because like the guys said, there's only a certain number of pins, certain amount of I/O. But I think for most people, once they hear how much is available, they might be a little more comfortable with it, or maybe they won't, but at least they'll know what it is. So, for example, you get 4 temperature inputs, 11 analog voltages, 10 DI, which would be like a switch on-off. Digital could also be like a wheel speed, one of your cam position sensors that's not the primary one. Your primary triggering is all separate from that. So, if you wanted to have, for example, let's say 15 auxiliary sensors, this is probably going to not be the right choice unless you want to do a CAN add-on module, which you can easily do. And then for a few $100, you could add those additional sensors. But yeah, as far as hardwiring them straight to the ECU, if you want to have more than 4 temperatures, more than 10 digital inputs, more than 11 analog voltage inputs, that's where you get beyond it. So for someone who just has, let's say, like oil pressure and temp, fuel pressure, flex fuel, intake air temp, coolant temp, your drive-by-wire, gear position sensor, strain gauge, coolant pressure, crankcase pressure, these are all things well within the limits of the plug and play. Eventually you get beyond it, but I think just kind of important to give people an idea, like when we say there's a limit, it's not like you can only have oil pressure or fuel pressure, you got to choose and that's it. There are a decent number of inputs, also lots of outputs. I can give you an exact number quick just so I don't. Let's see. So you've got 8 auxiliary outputs that are available plus 9 more, so 17, not counting the 4 injectors and 4 coils. So still a pretty high number.
And
So-
to clarify on that, is that on the plugin or is
Plug-in.
that on the
This is a plug and play.
Okay.
There are certain plugins that are really old, like if you're getting one for like a version 2 actual JDM WX wiring harness, it is going to be a few less than that. But if you're getting a modern one, there's a lot.
Sweet. All right, we're gonna move on to these are gonna be a couple of fairly heavy hitters, and then I think the last 3 are gonna go pretty quick. First one we're gonna talk about is Emtron. This is what's currently in Boogie. These guys have really been coming on in recent years. Some of you guys may not have heard of this brand, but Emtron is a very, very capable unit. So I think we're gonna start with Graham, because Graham is a giant lover of Emtron, and I'm interested to see his take on this. But Graham, what's your take on Emtron, bud?
Sure. Yeah. So Emtron has been absolutely wonderful. I'll try not to cover all the points because I know how much Mike and Sam love Emtron too. So I'll try to save some for them. But yeah, this has become one of my favorite ECUs to work with in terms of just how powerful it is, how many interesting things it can do, how flexible it is. The data logging is fantastic. You can log a ton of data very quickly. We went into some detail, when we talked about this before, but they've got some very interesting, unique things that I'm not aware, aside from maybe some of these ECUs we're going to talk about that I haven't done, but like their throttle mass flow model for calculating the airflow at part throttle, like we're using on your car now to make your car run so much smoother on track on transient throttle. Like it's hard to explain that to people when you're trying to sell them an ECU. It's easy to go over their head and explain how that can be so valuable in some applications, like with your car. But that stuff is very powerful, very interesting, especially from somebody who's a computer science nerd. The more control, the more things I can tinker with and play with, and the more I can make an engine run extremely smooth at all throttle positions, all RPMs, all boost pressures, the more excited I get. I'm me, I'm not somebody who just cares about quarter mile time, trap speed, horsepower. I want the car to start, run, and drive better than stock, but still make all that horsepower. I really like drivability, and Emtron to me has been one of the best ECUs to work with to get some incredible drivability because of these things that they can do. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of it. It's become kind of our, like, if the conversation for a standalone moves towards competition, or you really want to have some incredible control, or these things I'm telling you about get you excited and you want that on your car, then we've been selling and tuning Emtron, and it's been absolutely wonderful. So we put it in your car this year, and it's been nothing but amazing. The ability to quickly solve problems because of having really good data and really good ways to handle solutions. Like, for example, you broke your transmission at Mid-Ohio and we had to put in a longer fifth gear. And that jump from 4 to 5 was huge and the car was bogging down. I grabbed some data from your session. I quickly put together a timer-based system and integrated, your clutch pedal. I basically gave you the ability to do this kind of unique flat foot shift between 4 and 5 to hold the power. And I used the data from one session to know exactly how to time it. And you took it out there and it worked perfect. That's the kind of thing that was really hard to do before we had your car on the Haltech, is, the data wasn't there to really see what was going on, and the control wasn't there to really get it as precise as I wanted. It would take several iterations, and when you're at the track, you don't have time for that. So yeah, to me, it's become an absolute favorite. It's the number one ECU that we recommend for competition use, high-end use, and yeah, big thumbs up.
So I want to add something to this too, because I went from a Haltech to an Emtron, and making almost the exact same amount of power. It was immediately noticeable how much better the car drove, even on track, at RPM, but, partial throttle stuff, how much smoother the car just was. It just from a driving standpoint, I am not a tuner. I am not even remotely a tuner, but it was night and day. So we didn't change really anything about the engine, the turbo, mounts, anything like that. And it was immediately noticeable. So just throw my 2 cents in there. Sam, don't talk her ear off all day because I know you might, but let's hear about Emtron.
I think the main insight that I want to give as far as Emtron goes when it comes to comparing it to other ECUs is the word control. I think Emtron does control better than anything else that I've used. And what I mean by that is they don't implement a crucial feature in the ECU that doesn't give the calibrator all the control that you can ever want on that feature. And that goes from everything as basic as fueling, cam angles, boost control, launch control, rolling launch control, like idle control, wideband control. There's so much control that it's borderline overwhelming. And it really helps the more cars you do with Emtron to kind of like lean on your past success, things that have worked really well for you in the past with other cars that you've done to kind of like evolve that. It's almost like you do your first car on Emtron and the next one you do, and then the next one you do, and then the next one you do. They just get exponentially better and better and better as far as like how they run and how they operate. And that's not to say that other ECUs can't control certain things just as well, but I think Emtron has gone above and beyond down to the very fundamental level of how it fuels the engine. Ultimately, what people have to understand about standalone ECUs and ECUs for that matter is that you're trying to get air in and determine to the ultimate precision level how much of that air is in the cylinder right before you inject that fuel. How much air is coming in and you're injecting that fuel um to get the perfect amount of fuel in that cylinder and ignite it at just the right time to make the optimum safest amount of power. Ultimately that's what you're doing with a standalone, right? That's the be all end all of a standalone, is that's the main feature. Everything else is just add-ons. And I think Emtron started at the OEM level, where they implemented things that they saw on cars like EcoBoost Mustangs and Hyundai Genesis Coupes and the likes of VW Audi and those cars that they have boosted cars from the factory that don't use an air mass flow meter. They don't, it basically, it doesn't run just on a speed density algorithm that looks at the map sensor. There's limitations to that. Speed density is really good at doing one thing, and it's not so good at doing other things. And I feel like the way that Emtron has implemented fuel control is ultimately what leads to it running so well and so smoothly, because it takes their TMF model, like Graham mentioned, it basically implements that OEM level of measuring or measuring some sensors to estimate an airflow, which is what speed density does anyways. It estimates airflow, it doesn't actually measure it. That's what the mass airflow sensor can actually do. It can actually measure the mass airflow that's going through the engine. Ultimately, all you're trying to do is match your target's or air mass that you have coming in, that because you're reading it through sensors, and then injecting the right mass of fuel with your injector characterization data, your fuel density, the fuel type that you're using, the fuel temperature, like if it's ethanol, the ethanol content, that all changes how much mass of fuel you need to meet a certain air fuel ratio in the engine. And that applies to any fuel that you use on a internal combustion engine. So what they do really well is they implemented that super awesome TMF model that reads it sort of like a virtual mass airflow sensor, but it uses a pressure sensor and a temperature sensor in the charge pipe, not just the one that's in the intake manifold, to preemptively sort of act as like a virtual mass airflow sensor without the limitation of a mass airflow sensor. And it does it through math and formulas and all this kind of background math that it does, that I could sit here and just talk about a bunch. But basically, you have a math and speed density all at once, and so you can take care of anything that is partial throttle, anything that is idle. You can take care of it with that really precise model that uses those map sensors to estimate the airflow going to the engine before it's even in the intake plenum, to run everything, and then you blend it out to what speed density is actually really good at doing, which is wide open throttle. Speed density is the best at doing wide open throttle, but it's not great at doing partial throttle where there's vacuum in the intake manifold. So you take those two, and it's great. Now, you could say, hey, I can do it with any ECU using a mass airflow sensor. Sure, until you run out of mass airflow sensor and you don't have any more mass airflow sensor to measure that air in because you maxed it out. You can max out frequency-based mass airflow sensors. You can max out voltage-based hot element mass airflow sensors. So you get to a point where it's physically impossible for you to use that and measure the airflow going in accurately, just because you run out of sensor. So it's and I see in the comment neural network. Yeah, that neural network, that's what it does. It uses multiple map sensors in different locations, but it's less like the neural network on Dodge cars, and it's more like the EcoBoost cars, where they just simply use a map sensor to look at the pressure ratio across that throttle blade, and it basically, because there is a pressure differential across that throttle blade in the intake plenum and in the charge pipe, you can estimate what that airflow is pretty accurately if you have the temperature of the air. That all that I just said, all that mumbo jumbo, everything that I just said that probably went over the head of a lot of people because they don't really care about all that stuff. That's what us tuners have the job and the task of utilizing to our best extent to make your car run the best that you can. And that's probably part of the reason, if not most of the reason, is why you feel your car runs so much better on the Emtron. It's because it has that extreme level of control, and that extrapolates that in the Emtron ecosystem to everything, including your closed loop launch control, something that a lot of ECUs don't have. The only one that does it really, really good that is not a Motec is FuelTech. That's literally the only one. Every other ECU, the launch control is pretty simple. It doesn't act in a very strict, highly processed, very fast PID loop. So it's the control that you have with an Emtron ECU and the ability to create custom strategies, like what Graham said, just further adds onto that topic of control. So I think what Emtron does better than the options, even in the same price range as the SLs, that's another thing about Emtron. It's not like the Elite and the Nexus that are two completely different ECUs as far as like hardware and capabilities go. Even though you have the firmware from the Nexus into the Elite now, that doesn't mean that it's interchangeable. That's the reason why they're coming out with the new S2 and S3 ECUs, because they know that you're limited by the hardware, because the hardware is like what, 14 years old at this point. It's super old hardware. So the Emtron takes the SL or the KV, which is their flagship ECU, which is equivalent to something like a Motec M150, and it basically cuts it down in half and takes a bunch of IO out of it and just gives you a smaller package at a lower price point. And that price point is very akin to something like an Extreme X that is a wire in, very akin to something like an Elite 1500 or Elite 2500. Um, and you lose out on IO. But if your car needs, just like yours, Boogie, if your car needs the IO that the KV has and the control that you have with a KV ECU, where you have dual drive-by wires, and if you need 4, you can up to a KV12 or KV16 to do things like anti-surge and run a drive-by-wire throttle with anti-surge, and maybe run an E-gate in combination with that, and just get really crazy with the car. Then you can get the KV8, KV12, KV16. But if you have something like an STI that you're going to do HPDE with and whatnot, Graham and I have been working together, getting a lot of cars on SL series ECU, because they're a really good price. They're priced really fairly for how capable they are, and the firmware on the SL is the exact same. It has the exact same capabilities and control as the firmware on the KB. You don't get because they started with the KV. That was what they started with. So they just watered down the KV to an SL. They didn't start with a less capable ECU and then brought it up like other companies have done. So you have all this control on every single feature, and if you have an SL, all you're short on is inputs and outputs. If you need more inputs and outputs, you get a KV. If you want onboard wideband, get a KV, and you got 2 onboard widebands. If you want to save a little bit of money, then get an SL with a ELC1 lambda controller, which every other ECU needs, that we have talked about. Link needs their Link LTC, or you can use a Motec LTC, or you can use a Haltech WB1 or WB2. Emtron has their ELC. You can use AM X series wideband on it as well. You can, it's they're pretty much apples to apples when it comes to some of those hardware limitations, because they're in that same price range and they're built for that price range. And it's almost like they all like got together and were like, okay, so what are they doing? What's Haltech doing? What's Link doing? Okay, so this is an acceptable feature set that we can include in this ECU and sell it. So that's where the SL to KV comparison comes in. You have 2 options. You have SL with a 4, 6, or 8 cylinder option because of the ignition and injection outputs that you have. Everything else is similar except knock control and CAN bus control. So knock and CAN bus, there's 1 on the SL, which is the cheapest ECU that they have, and there's 4 injectors and 4 ignition outputs. And then on the SL8, you have SL6, which is 6, and the SL8, which is 8, for like a sequential 8-cylinder. So you have 8 injection, 8 ignition. You could do dual injector setup on a Subaru on an SL8, depending on how many AVCS you have and stuff like that. So you're talking about an ECU that's cheaper than an M130, which is considered like this flagship, oh my god, ECU, which I'm sure we'll talk about why I'm saying oh my god ECU flagship, and it's not really that. It's you can do things that you can do with ECUs that cost more money with an ECU that costs less money, and it's just as capable, if not more capable. We'll talk about why I specifically am referring to the fact that you need a specific firmware to do things on a Motec, and you're limited by the firmware that's in that.
We're getting there.
So on the Emtron, you're not limited by that. You get the full-fledged, fully capable firmware as soon as you buy the ECU. You don't have to pay for an extra firmware. You don't have to pay for extra features. You don't have to get a different ECU for different features. It's just a matter of the IO that is present in the ECU is going to determine which of the 2 series of ECUs you're gonna get. Now, I'm partial to Emtron. Every single car that has come to me in the past probably like 2 years, I've recommended Emtron when they don't have an ECU option. And that's because I believe very much in the product and how capable it is. And I think that even the most capable tuner on another platform if they were just as capable in that platform as they are on the Emtron, the Emtron car would just run better. 100%. It's just it all comes down to a tuner preference, like we talked about earlier, but also the capability within that firmware. I'm sure someone like Mike that is very, very versed in Link would rather use Link just because it's like second nature for him. And even though, he's used Emtron and he likes Emtron, he has his, his things that he doesn't like about Emtron, just like we all do about different systems like Haltech, Link, Megasquirt, so on and so forth. So I'll let Mike add on to that, but that's the main thing I wanted to focus on.
Mike, you're up.
Control.
Yeah. I assume we're getting to the tail end of this.
Yes, we're getting real close. I'm sorry, bud.
No, you're good. The reason I said that was I imagine we're going to talk about Motec and
literally
you mentioned Bosch. And so as we get to the tail end of this, I'm going to probably start kind of grouping things together and comparing because you start to get into a lot of similarities here. And I think that maybe that'll help us kind of speed things up. So, these guys made tons of great points about Emtron. There are things that we could pick out in each ECU as it does them extremely well. Others maybe not quite their strong suit, but by the time we get to like Link, Emtron, Motec, Bosch Motorsport, they're all going to be a yes for me. When you talk about Bosch Motorsport, only if you can, any of the ones over $2,000 were like, if you can afford it and you really want it, but aside from that, these are all a yes, for sure. And, when it comes to the Emtron, the guys talked about control. They talked about accurate measurement of air mass. And that is essentially what creates the improvement in the drivability. If you know how much air you have, you deliver the right amount of fuel, combustion is really smooth, proper, everything feels crisp and clean and smooth. That's what you want. So that's something you can certainly achieve many different ways with different ECUs. That particular way works really, really well. It's not the only way, but it is fantastic. I will say, for example, like on a Motec, they also have a pretty good model. It does not work the same way, but it does allow you to use throttle as well as pressure. On a Link, personally, I use throttle as well as speed density. I don't just use one or the other. And that's essentially how you get that, in between throttle angle, correct air mass calculation. And then often I'll add in exhaust pressure if I need to make it even better, which is something you can also do on Emtron. So it kind of like there's varying levels to how accurate you want this to be. You've got speed density, it's pretty good. You add in throttle angle, it gets better. You add in that pre-throttle map sensor, it gets a little better. You add in exhaust pressure, it gets even better. And in terms of the customer, I think what this might mean for them, and aside from drivability, is once you get the tune done, let's say you want to change something, like let's say you want to change the hot side on a turbo, swap the turbo out, something like that, the speed with which your tuner can make adjustments for that gets better with some of these methods. So for example, if you're doing throttle plus speed density plus exhaust pressure and you swap the turbo out, the car's just going to run. You're pretty much going to put it on the dyno and send it. It's not like you're going to spend 4 hours, before you can do a dyno pull. So that's, just trying to kind of bring this back to practically like, what does this mean for me, the customer? Drivability, accuracy means reliability, right? If you're dead on with your air fuel ratio at all times, the engine's going to last a heck of a lot longer than one that's on target most of the time, right? So that's really important. And then once you get to this level, the safety features are phenomenal. So on lower level ECUs, either they won't have a safety feature or they'll have it, but maybe it's really limited in how it can respond to something being incorrect. So for example, a lot of people will buy a digital dash and, they'll have an oil pressure alarm. And, if the oil pressure goes under 20 PSI, the light comes on. And basically what that means is, if you have no oil pressure at all, but you don't know if it's where it should be. And a lot of ECUs are kind of the same way, where you might have limited ability to monitor for something and do something about it. But when you get to the more advanced ECUs, you can decide, all right, I'm going to reduce torque. I'm not just going to cut the engine, or I'm going to switch to an alternate throttle mapping. So for example, I'll do this on a rally car. I'll switch to an alternate throttle mapping, different torque setting, and let them continue while the car cools down, not fully cut it off, something like that. So you get into the ability to do these more advanced strategies, starting, I would say, with a Link, somewhat with a Haltech for some of that stuff as well, and then more so when you get to an Emtron. When we talk about Motec, Sam mentioned, you're essentially buying firmware that is more fixed. I would say Link and Emtron are both very flexible in terms of custom tables, or I want to change the axis on this table and make it work in a different way, where the Motec stuff is pretty much, we've decided this works great, and it does work great. But if you, for whatever reason, just want to do it differently, you've got to write your own code, and you're getting into a development license. You're getting into a level that most people aren't going to have the knowledge or budget for, let's say, where most of the time you're going to go with a Motec package that does what you need it to do, and that's why you chose that ECU. And it works phenomenal in that scenario. But if you look at the firmware for a Motec and you say, you know what, this isn't really going to fit for this particular project because I want to do this thing that it just won't allow me to do, then you're probably going to want to look at something else, like the Link, the Emtron, Bosch Motorsport. All of those will let you do different types of strategies. And once you get into that, there is a point where you're going to find, all right, now I'm doing a whole lot of that, a whole lot of custom strategies, tons of sensors, and that's more your Emtron range. So there's certainly a point where, a build might get wild enough where it's like, look, this is really the only option. You're doing this, you're doing a Bosch Motorsport. The other options just aren't really going to fit the bill. And I think most of the folks listening probably aren't going to absolutely need that, but might like the idea that they could have it. And, in the meantime would benefit from just that general excellent accuracy in the airflow model and other features like that, like great drivability. And again, the great safety features. Personally, one thing I'll say, out of all the good ECUs, one thing that's a really huge step up for me is torque-based systems. So Emtron does this, Motec does this in some packages, but not all. Bosch Motorsport absolutely does this. You set up a car with enough power, suddenly you just don't want all of it all the time. You want, especially probably a lot of people listening who do road course stuff, on a road course car, you want your torque to be manageable. You want to be able to drive the car out of the corner without it just busting all four tires loose and looking like a drift car, right? So I've done that. That's it's fun. It looks cool.
Yeah, just get good.
Yeah, so it's fun. Probably not the fastest way around the track. And
Lies.
When you get into a system like that, like on my GTR, for example, which has a Motec in it, you're running, not only boost by gear, but torque by gear. You know exactly how much traction at the axle that this gear can support on this tire. And then you're running that within a margin to your traction control, and you're integrating those systems together. And that's where you get into, Emtron, Motec, Bosch Motorsport. So that's that level. As soon as you get into torque management, torque-based systems, those are your three, I think, out of the ones that I believe you like.
The real fast. So I'm gonna obviously take that as a yes. You've already said that. Real fast. I really want to touch on between Emtron and Motec, the pricing ends up getting kind of similar and they get compared a lot. I really want to hear you guys' thoughts about Motec. And then the rest of it, we've got Pectel, Syvecs, and Bosch Motorsports. Realistically, those are out of the range of a lot of the most people. It's kind of if you know, You know what I mean? If if you're about to spend the amount of money for a Bosch Motorsports ECU, you need a Bosch Motorsports ECU. And so honestly, discussing that is probably even kind of silly and out of the realm of this. So I don't think we're going to dive into those too much. So we're going to go, what I really want you to do is I want you to talk about Motec real quick. And maybe your differences, what you prefer between Emtron and Motec, and what your quick take is. You kind of already nailed most of it. But yeah, I think the big takeaway, and one of the things that kind of annoyed me about Motec when I was looking into it personally was having to get the firmware upgrades, or the different firmware kind of like keyhole you into certain things, and that can be a little weird to people that don't know how to navigate that. So I guess I'll start back with you, Mike, and just real quick on that. If you want to touch on that, it'd be sweet.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to every ECU we've talked about, except for Motec and Bosch Motorsport, when you buy the product, you have full use of it. There's no separate licensing or that sort of thing. With Motec, you need to buy a package, which is effectively the firmware, which determines the software functionality that you have access to. And then you also would purchase data logging, depending on how good you want it to be. And how many things you can log, how fast, for how long. When you get to Bosch Motorsport, you're not only getting into that sort of thing, but if you want custom application, we could be talking about tens of thousands of dollars. So again, probably out of the realm of what most folks listening are going to be getting into. In terms of cost, Motec and Emtron can be similarly priced, but for the most part, Motec would be more expensive, especially after you get the firmware package, and then buy the logging. So I'll give you an example. For me, if I'm tuning a Motec, I get level 3 logging every time, which is their best level. That's the one that allows you to log hundreds of things and do so very quickly. Usually that's because if someone's getting a Motec ECU, they're probably doing things that I want to monitor at high speed. Like, for example, gear shift control, where, I want to see the barrel position as the gear is, rotating on a sequential transmission, things like that. So I want to be able to log these things. So I'm always just going to get that, and I just kind of consider that a given part of the price. So you're certainly over, let's say, $4,000 for sure. You could be up to 6 on something like that, or even higher, depending on the options and such. Where the Emtron stuff, the price is going to be certainly more known, because it just is what it is. You buy the box and that's it. You got everything. In terms of firmware, there's certain people who have given Motec a little bit of level of flexibility. So for example, we talked about the CAN on Link is extremely flexible, can do a ton of stuff, which is really cool. On Motec, it sends a fixed data stream. You get what you get. But with certain firmwares, you get the ability to add, okay, I want to send this piece of data on this channel. You can do some very limited stuff. Like, I want to send a couple more signals out. And then on Emtron, you can do some of that as well. But on Motec, I would say with most firmware packages, CAN bus is going to be mostly set up a manner that it works really well when you're just plug and playing with other Motec units, like a Motec wideband, like a E888 IO expander, or a Motec Dash, for example. But when you're doing stuff like I love to do, like mix and matching what I feel is the best of various brands, I think Motec is certainly more designed for you to work within their ecosystem, whereas Emtron and Link both focus more on, being able to use their product with other products that are out there in the market. And as CAN modules become more prevalent, and there's tons of awesome ones out there, I think that's a really important feature for future expandability. And then other than that, I'm just going to do a quickie roll into Syvecs and Life are in the same pretty much price range as like an Emtron. I think Emtron generally does things better. They would be my choice. So Emtron, Motec, Bosch Motorsport, all yay for me. A no for me on Life and Syvecs. mostly because of efficiency of tuning, which results in the cost being significantly higher to the consumer based on the hours required, and enjoyability of using the product is much greater on the ones that I like.
Well, there you go. Have you messed with a Pectel at all?
Yeah, quite a long time ago, like 2005 was the first one, and then one more recently. I think I kind of put them along the lines of the other British ECUs, like Life and Syvecs, where they have a kind of different take on how to do software and user interfaces, how things should work, documentation as well. I think most of the ECUs we talked about, we didn't really mention it, but most of them are Australian or from New Zealand. And the folks down there really just seem to do a phenomenal job of engine management. You know, for whatever reason, they're kind of the mecca of that. And the Brits certainly can control an engine, but not in a way that I want to use it.
Well, there you go. Graham?
Yeah.
What's your take on Motec? And then if you want to touch on Pectel, Syvecs, or Bosch, let me hear it.
Sure. All right. So yeah, Motec's definitely an ECU that I really like. Have spent a lot of time working with. Happy to support. As Mike has said, you know, as long as you fit in the box and you fit the firmware that you're buying, it's fantastic. If you have needs that are outside of that, then you're going to get a little bit stuck. For most people, for a lot of applications, you're going to fit within that box. If you upgrade the logging, you're going to get good logging. It gets a bit more spendy to get there compared to a well spec'd out Emtron, but you know, it's certainly a good option. If you have it on your car and you come to me, I'm happy to work with it. The other place where Motec is one of the most valuable ECUs is if we're talking about direct injection engines. There's no direct, no pun intended, there's no direct way to do direct injection easily with the other ECUs we've talked about. Emtron can control a direct injector controller, which is kind of an interesting thing I've been looking at a little bit. Link is working on some direct injection control, but Motec already has it and they do it well. So if we have to control an FA engine, for example, Motec's really the only option and it works fantastic for that. I've been waiting patiently to get a Motec for my GR Corolla. I'm going to pass on Syvecs. I'll explain why in a moment, but I run a Motec on my turbo side-by-side with a John Reed racing package, and the firmware is fantastic, and my side-by-side is incredibly fun with boost control, knock sensor, flex fuel. It works great. So I like Motec a lot. It's definitely a yes for me, but when people come to me with nothing and they're looking for a good value and something that they can kind of grow with and do really cool motorsports things with, Emtron has been my choice over Motec because of all the things it can do, because of a really good price point. So if it's not direct injection, I lean towards Emtron. If it's direct injection, Motec is really the only option. So that's kind of where I stand on that. I've never worked with Bosch Motorsports, can't speak on it. It's intriguing. I'm looking at the prices on my left and it's insane, but I'm sure it's phenomenal. But that's probably a world that I'll never dip my toes into, but maybe. Syvecs is interesting. Syvecs has some pretty, like, they do some cool projects, and the guys over there seem to be extremely intelligent and are able to figure out how to do CAN bus and control some modern engines. You can get a Syvecs for a GR Corolla, and that's pretty wild, except when you look at the software and the firmware and the way it's calculating fuel, you start scratching your head and feel like you're looking at the matrix to try to tune it. And it becomes a really, I don't know, to Mike's point, it's not, the software and the UI is not something that I want to have to spend time trying to understand and figure out. And then as I've understood it from other tuners, there can be some shortcomings, kind of like the AEM keeping track of timing. There can also be just other kind of weird firmware things that they have to fix. It's good. It can be really good, but it feels like it just doesn't ever get polished enough before it goes out the door. I don't know. Mike's shaking his head, so maybe I'm saying the right things here. But so I certainly wouldn't be interested in doing Syvecs again for personal reasons and because of the things I've seen that I don't feel like work very well. But yeah, I think I'm in the same boat where, it's for standalones, it's Link, Emtron, Motec is definitely great in its applications, and that's what I like to work with.
Sweet. All right, Sam.
So I wanted to touch back on the Emtron thing, which ties into this talk about Motec as well. What Mike mentioned about the torque strategies in the Emtron that is included with the firmware on the SL and the KV, just likewise. Emtron does something that no other ECU below its price range does, and that is actually use the drive-by-wire throttle body for something other than opening and closing it and idling the car. And what I mean by that is, sure, you can set some drive-by-wire position offsets and whatnot on some of the ECUs. But as far as Emtron goes, your torque is calculated based on your actual throttle position, and you can regulate your torque using your actual throttle body. And how that is different to ECUs below Emtron, is that you can basically tell the ECU, hey, I want you to reduce this much torque from the engine using the throttle. It is able to calculate the exact opening of the throttle that it needs to meet that torque target, and that is something that you cannot do with anything other than, like Mike said, Bosch Motorsports or a custom M1 firmware that has that built into it. And I think that is an incredibly insane value for the money when it comes to using Emtron on a time attack car, because you're able to meet things. Time attack is just becoming like drag racing, where your classes are getting limited by things that, like tire type, like drag racing, small tire or whatever, or you have to use a manual transmission, a stick shift transmission. And time attack, it's becoming kind of the same, where you have these cars that can make huge amounts of power. Like, I mean, you could probably make 1,000 horsepower with Boogie, but are you able to put it down through 200 tread wear tires? No, you can't. However, what if you want to have that 1,000 horsepower and you can put it down in a straight line in the back of Portland International in 6
I'll
gear?
try it.
Then you can do that with Emtron, because you can tell it, hey, when you're below 6 gear, don't give me this much torque. And you have all these driver demand torque tables that you can build and stuff like that, that partially can use or totally can use the throttle body if you need to. And in applications like we were talking about neural network earlier, like the Hellcats, when you have a twin screw supercharger like that, you use your throttle to control torque. Like, using timing and ignition cuts and fuel cuts is unnecessary, because all you need to do is choke the supercharger a little bit and you can control torque that way much easier. If you need less but quicker torque control, then you can use different strategies like timing retard, or fuel cutting or ignition cutting. But as far as like controlling the course torque, going from 1,000 Newton meters to 500, close the throttle a certain amount, and what that amount is at that point in time, in the conditions that the car is in, is something that only an ECU like Emtron, that has a torque model built into it at its core, or an M1 with a torque-based modeling firmware, or Bosch Motorsports ECU, can do. Something like a Haltech, where basically the ECU just uses the throttle body to idle the car by targeting a certain position at your idle RPM target, or you look at the pedal input and that's how much you move the throttle based on a table that you can build. You can't do that with an ECU like that, because it doesn't work like that at its core. So I think if we start comparing Motec versus Emtron, I'm not 100% sure as far as how much a firmware that uses torque modeling on an M1 costs. I'm sure it's more expensive than something like a plug-in firmware for a Subaru. So since we're talking in a Subaru podcast, if you're going to get a John Reed software for a Subaru using an M150 on a 2021 STI, then you are going to be constricted to the firmware that John Reed designed for that specific application, right? And you're going to be paying $4,800 for the ECU, an adapter, and the firmware, no wideband included, no DC-DC control built into it because that costs extra, and a bunch of other things that you're going to be limited on, and it doesn't have a torque-based model into it. So if you want to take your car to the next level, but not have to redo your whole wiring harness, which you know how much it costs. If you don't want to have to do that, and you just want a plug and play solution that you just use a patch harness for, and you also don't want to pay for a custom firmware on a Motec to do that specific thing that is torque modeling, traction control via torque management and whatnot, then you're going to have to pay a lot more money going Motec than you would Emtron, even talking KV8. Because we're talking, if you buy one of my, and sorry for the plug-in for my products.
This guy's plug-in. Nah, do your thing.
If you buy one of my plug and play adapters, that's going to cost you $675, and that will allow you to put in an Emtron KV8 that costs $3,200 and has 2 wideband channels built into it. You're going to be able to plug that in for less than $3,800. Meanwhile, the plug and play John Reed software based with a patch harness Motec costs $4,800 with no DCCD control. We can include DCCD control if you ask me to do it. I can include it as part of the harness, and it'll cost you a little bit extra, just like the John Reed package will cost you a little bit extra to include DCCD in it. But it can be done. The ECU itself has a differential control strategy in it, and you are using it right now in your car, and you can tell me whether or not it works really well. I think I was able to.
I mean, we're still playing around with it, but even on a base level, yeah, it's working really well.
Yeah, one of my customers, Austin, one of the issues that he had with his car was he went to a different rear diff that is a clutch type rear diff, and he was getting too much rotation in some turns when he applied throttle. And we were able to completely eliminate that just because we were controlling DCCD, and we were able to bias the front a little bit and get the car to understeer a little bit more than it was oversteering. And we were able to control that stuff inside the Emtron with no external controllers. And that is something that you can do on M1, and that is something that other ECUs don't have as a control strategy. You might be able to build a generic table that controls your DCCD solenoid based on certain conditions that the ECU manufacturer determined that you can use in those generic tables, because that's another conversation altogether. But the thing, again, we go back to the topic of control. You can control things in such a way for the price point that Emtron is at that some of the guys at Emtron think that Emtron should be more expensive. And just because of that, just because it has all that. And if you were to go to something that can do what Emtron can do, you have to pay a lot more money to do it. And when Mike and I were having that initial conversation over Facebook on the comments, that's what I meant by it, Mike. It's just the bang for buck that you get when you go to that level. But granted, guys that are doing HPDE with 400 horsepower, they don't need torque management on an Emtron. Subaru is very well capable of putting 400 horsepower down on 200 tread tires. Like, that's not a need for those guys. But guys that are trying to get into serious like competition, like you are, Dewey, where you want to just take your car to the next level and keep evolving with your car, you just put an ECU in your car that can do what you need right now and what can do what you're going to need 3 years down the road. And I think it's more of an investment, and investment sounds like, oh, you're about to drop a lot of money. But when you think about it, you're really not. You're spending $3,200 on an ECU that the comparable M1 Motec that can do what the KV8 can do costs you a lot more money, because you have to pay for that firmware extra, and you have to pay to have 500 hertz logging on as an extra logging feature on the ECU and whatnot. Everything on Motec is like you get your burger with your buns, and then if you want lettuce, bacon, cheese, ketchup, everything, you have to pay extra for everything. Motec is built on a structure of paywalling every single.
Yeah, but is it premium lettuce? Like premium lettuce?
It might be in recall.
It might be some real premium lettuce. Maybe that's some really high-end mayo. Okay.
So
that's
just quick.
Yeah.
I just want to put a dollar number on the thing you were talking about. If you want a universal firmware for your Motec that does torque control, so let's say run a Subaru, that firmware is $2,200. Just to put a number on it.
Yeah.
It's possible. It's very expensive. You do purchase it separately.
And for $2,200, you pay $2,000 and you get an SLA that can control a 2021 STI with torque modeling built into it. So you get the full ECU for the price of the firmware that can do that on Motec, and that's without the ECU package itself. So you're paying, let's say, the M1 50 to control, fully control an STI 2021 with dual AVCS and all that. That would cost you what, like $3,000, give or take, $2,700, $3,000. So you're paying $3,000 plus $2,500 almost for a firmware that puts you at $5,500 almost, and you don't even have a wideband yet.
All right, so I'm gonna take that as a maybe for Motec for you, just because Emtron exists.
If you're buying an ECU brand new, and you want to buy once, cry once, spend less money on an Emtron. As funny as that sounds.
Okay. Have you messed around with Pectel, Syvecs, or Bosch Motorsports yet?
I have not messed with Pectel or Bosch Motorsports. I'm
Okay.
on the same boat as Graham when it comes to Bosch Motorsports. Maybe someday I'll get there. I'm 32 years old, so maybe when I'm 60, I'll have my
You're
first
probably the youngest one here. So
Bosch Motorsports car. I probably
he's
am.
a fetus.
I'm the baby. Samuel baby. I have a car at my shop right now that has a Syvecs GDI 4 in it. This is a Mazda Speed 3 2008. What a freaking nightmare this thing has been. I think this is the first and last car with Syvecs that I will ever accept as something that I bring into my shop. It's been I'm working with another tuner that is very reputable in the Syvecs community, and he's been phenomenal to work with. I personally I am not afraid to hand off the task of calibrating a car to somebody that is much more capable of doing it with that specific platform than I am. Um, Ultimately, I want what's best for the customer and for them to get the best end product. So on this particular application, I made a plug and play patch harness to eliminate the stock ECU because they're doing a race car stuff. And right now we are running into some problems with the GDI system. The ECU is basically losing all voltage when you go to crank it over and try to fire up, and it turns off. The ECU turns off, and it doesn't start the car. So we're trying to sort that out. We're talking with Syvecs, see what's going on. My suspicion, with my very limited knowledge of Syvecs, is that I think it's a thing where the ECU is just not getting enough juice. Like it doesn't have enough power inputs into the ECU. It only has one pin, and it uses that Bosch like BMW M50 style connector on it, and it uses one of the smaller form factor pins on it for all the power on the ECU, including driving the DI injectors, driving the port injectors, driving the DI pump, driving all the sensors, powering all the sensors, everything. One pin power input. That's it. And so when you go to crank it over with the injectors connected, I narrow it down to the injectors. When you go to crank it over with the injectors connected, you crank it over and it goes to 6 volts, and the ECU has a threshold of 6.5, where when it goes below 6.5, it turns the ECU off as a protection. And so right now we can't even start the car. So we're trying to sort through that, trying
Big
to figure that
fun.
out. And this was because, the customer, his idea was I can spend less money on Syvecs, get it running. And at this point, he spent more money than he would have just gotten with an M1 setup for that car. Because I say M1 because it's one of the only plug and play options available for this platform out there. And it works perfect. There's cars running 8 seconds, I think 7 seconds out there.
That's gonna run me into my final point, basically. Okay, my final point I want to make on this, and I'm sure you guys all agree with this, that the first determining factor, the biggest determining factor of what ECU you pick is what your chosen tuner recommends for what you are trying to do. You need to talk to your tuner. These are 3 guys out of thousands you could talk to. Whoever is tuning this vehicle, have a very serious conversation with them about what ECU, what tuning platform you should be using for whatever it is you are trying to do. And have that conversation. If you don't like the conversation the way it goes, maybe have a conversation with somebody else, but talk to your tuner first. You would rather them be comfortable with something than get this wildly insane capable thing that they don't know how to use. I bet you if you go to the UK, there are Subarus running all over the place, running Syvecs ECUs, and it's just, that's what they're used to driving, and used to tuning, and their whole tuning community there is just really used to using a Syvecs. And I think one of our biggest reasons, maybe Syvecs doesn't work great in the US is because there's a familiarity thing there where they're just, we're not used to that type of layout for the software, the way the ECU communicates or whatever. And Link, Emtron, the rest of these kind of function in the same layer. I've heard Graham bitch that Haltech can be its own monster. And little little things like that can really throw tuners off. And if they're not comfortable with what they're messing with, then your tune isn't going to be great. You know, the car's drivability or reliability or just power in general may suffer. Get what your tuner wants, or at least have that conversation first. Have the conversation with your tuner before you start, running onto the internet and buying an ECU. Anything
Before
to
is
add
the
on
key
that, guys?
word.
Yeah,
Yes.
I wanted to add on what you just said, Dewey. I think when it comes to selecting a tuner, when you're considering an ECU of this sort of caliber, going above and beyond the consumer grade ECUs, you reach the point where you have a relationship with your tuner, right? And that matters more. The trust that you have in the person responsible for your engine to be running in tip-top shape is a lot more important than the hardware that is behind the engine.
Yes.
Because if your tuner is extremely confident in using one piece of hardware and software and is able to do a much better job with that piece of firmware and software, and it all comes down to how much you trust that person, then you are giving your tuner the best tools possible to give you the best end result, which is at the end of the day all you want. Now, if you need certain features that the ECU that your tuner is more versed in, that you trust, is not able to use to the extent that they can use something like a Haltech or a Link or something like that. Let's say we're talking, Motec, Emtron, Haltech, Link, that kind of like that difference there. The guy that does Motec 24/7 is not going to be able to hop on an Emtron immediately and get everything working just as good as he could on a firmware that he probably himself built. Because that's another thing about the guys that do a lot of
Don't go down
Motec
the black
is
hole.
a lot of these like high end, like high level guys that are doing tuning on Motec. They're actually smart enough to build their own firmwares and they can sell you those firmwares. So not to dabble too much on that, but I think to add on to what you were saying, I think you end up picking what ECU is best for your project because you have a relationship with the person that is in charge of calibrating that piece of software and hardware. And that matters most at the end of the day, me being completely unbiased, that matters most and much more than the actual capabilities of the ECU itself. Now, if you don't have a tuner selected for the build that you're doing, let's say that you're building an LS car and Graham has 13 plus years of experience with Subarus, but I'm sure his experience with LS is much less compared to his experience with Subarus. And you want to pick some dude that has 20 plus years of LX experience. And you have this conversation with Graham, and Graham's like, "Hey, I want what's best for your project in that particular application." If it was me, I'd tell you go with him. Just like this guy I
Most good
recommended.
tuners will tell you that too.
Yeah, like that's what I recommended this guy. He was like, "Hey, I know this guy. I want him to tune the car. Are you okay with that?" Yes. I don't know what I'm doing with Syvecs. Get a guy that does, because if he tells me, "Hey, I need you to check this pin, this wiring, this that," I can do that, but I don't know how to navigate the MSDOS style, matrix software that Syvecs uses. So I'm not best suited for that. I'm not gonna shaft you because I don't know what I'm doing. So I think it mostly comes down to your relationship with the person that is in charge of tuning your
Yes.
car.
Well, I gotta kill this thing. I love you guys. This has been maybe the absolute most insane podcast we've had
This
yet.
has been good.
This has been phenomenal. Somebody even put in there, this has got OG forum post vibes, and I hope this gets shared around a lot. If you did make it all the way here and you had a good time, please share this. If people are trying to get a hold of you guys, I definitely want you to make a quick plug on if people want to get a hold of you guys. Mike, they want to get a hold of you. What's the best way to do it, though? I think Cobb's got you wrapped up in all sorts of stuff these days.
Oh no, I got plenty of time. No, innovativetuning.com, tuning at innovativetuning.com for email, innovative tuning on Instagram.
Sweet. Sam, if they're going to get a hold of you, what's the best way?
You can check out my website, dialedinmotorsports.net. My email is sam@dialedinmotorsports.net, and on the website you can also find my business phone number and whatnot. So if you see me on the socials and you want to have a chat, shoot me a message as well. I'll be happy to chat with you.
Graham, how are they getting a hold of you?
On the website, boostedperformancetuning.com, we have an email address that you can email. That's the easiest way. Sorry, don't mind my dog. He's ready for a walk. But yeah, go to our website, use the email. That will drop you into our consulting system. Kim will get back to you. She can answer 99% of the questions that I can answer, so you're not waiting for me, because I'm always busy on the dyno or tuning or whatever. She'll get you all figured out and get you in for tuning with me.
Yep. So yeah, don't be afraid to talk to Kim. She really does know what the hell she's talking about. Awesome, guys. This was great. We're gonna get this chopped up and out for a podcast. But this was great. If once again, if you got anything out of this, it's have a conversation with your tuner before you go spend a ton of money. But I hope this at least gave you maybe a small roadmap into what why certain tuners pick certain things and what they like and what they don't and the reason why. That was really the goal of this whole thing. And yeah, she's a long episode, but I think it was totally worth it. So again, thanks for sliding by, guys. This was great. And maybe in 2 years we'll do this again because the landscape could totally change. So see you guys.